The plan was simple: get away from the noise of the city and spend a weekend at a secluded Airbnb. Hollow Creek was the perfect spot, a cabin deep in the woods, far from any civilization. I booked it without hesitation, imagining a peaceful weekend, filled with long hikes, reading, and maybe even some stargazing. I needed the break, and after reading dozens of glowing reviews, I was convinced that this place would offer the tranquility I craved. The drive up was long and winding, the kind of route where your phone eventually loses signal and you're left with nothing but your thoughts and the quiet hum of the car. As I got closer to the cabin, the trees grew denser, towering over the narrow dirt road. The sense of isolation was palpable, but it was exactly what I had wanted. I pulled up in front of the cabin just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the forest in hues of orange and gold. The cabin itself was charming, with its wooden exterior and wraparound porch. It looked old but well maintained, nestled at the edge of the woods with a small creek running just behind it. There was something serene about the sound of the water trickling over rocks, a natural melody that immediately calmed my nerves. I stepped out of the car, taking a moment to breathe in the crisp, cool air. A sense of peace washed over me as I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The key had been left under a rock, just as the host, a man named Thomas, had instructed. The CRYPTID moment. I opened the door. The cabin greeted me with the smell of pine and the faint scent of wood smoke. It felt lived in, like it had stories hidden in its walls. The interior was cozy, with a stone fireplace dominating one side of the room, and a large, overstuffed couch positioned in front of it. A bookshelf lined the far wall, filled with old, dog-eared books. The kitchen was small but functional, and a narrow staircase led up to the loft where the bedroom was located. I settled in quickly, unpacking my things and lighting a fire in the hearth. The sun had fully set by then, leaving the woods outside shrouded in darkness. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. It was perfect. I spent the next couple of hours relaxing with a book and a glass of wine, the warmth of the fire making me drowsy. By the time I headed up to bed, I was in a state of blissful contentment. The bedroom in the loft was small but cozy, with a large window that offered a view of the creek and the trees beyond. I climbed into bed, pulling the heavy quilt up around me, and drifted off to sleep with ease. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The fire downstairs had long since died, and the cabin was silent except for the soft sound of the creek outside. I lay there for a moment, my mind still foggy with sleep. When I heard it, a soft creak, like the sound of a floorboard shifting under weight, I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. It had come from downstairs. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the house settling or the wind pushing against the walls. But as I strained to listen, I heard it again. Creak. It was unmistakable this time, and it wasn't the wind. Someone or something was downstairs. My mind raced, grasping for a logical explanation. Maybe an animal had gotten in, I thought. A raccoon, maybe, or some other small creature. But even as I tried to calm myself, I knew it didn't make sense. The doors were locked, and I had made sure to close all the windows before going to bed. I slowly sat up, my body tense, and glanced around the dark room. The cabin was old, so it was possible that the sounds were just the result of its age. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Another creak. This time, it was followed by a soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps moving slowly across the wooden floor. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, the faint glow of the screen illuminating the room just enough for me to see. I hadn't bothered to check for cell service earlier, and now, as I glanced at the screen, I saw that I had none. Of course. I cursed under my breath. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the living room to the other. I couldn't just stay up there, frozen in fear, but the thought of going downstairs sent a wave of panic through me. What if someone had broken in? What if there was someone in the cabin right now? I tried to think rationally. If there was an intruder, they would have heard me by now. The loft wasn't exactly soundproof, and my movements would have given me away. But whoever or whatever was downstairs didn't seem to care. The footsteps continued, pausing occasionally, as if the person was inspecting something. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for the worst. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, careful to avoid making any noise. I crept toward the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. As I reached the top of the staircase, I peered down into the dark living room. The fire had died completely, leaving the room in near total darkness. I squinted, trying to make out any shapes or movement, but all I could see were the faint outlines of the furniture. Then I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, they were louder and closer, directly beneath me. My blood turned to ice as I realized that whatever was down there was standing right at the foot of the stairs. I held my breath, not daring to move. The footsteps stopped, and for a long, agonizing moment there was only silence. Then in the darkness, I heard a soft, ragged breathing, slow and steady, like someone was standing just out of sight, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. I backed away from the stairs, my hands shaking. I had to get out of there. My only option was to make a run for the door, but that meant going downstairs, going toward whatever was down there. I took a deep breath, trying to steel myself for what I had to do. My heart raced as I moved back toward the stairs, my steps as silent as I could make them. I paused at the top, listening intently. The breathing had stopped, and the living room was eerily quiet again. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I bolted down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps. I didn't look back, didn't dare to, as I raced for the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock for what felt like an eternity before it finally clicked open. I threw the door open and ran out into the night, not stopping until I was halfway to my car. I stood there, panting, my breath forming clouds in the cold night air. The cabin loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't care. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. As I drove down the winding dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something standing in the cabin's doorway, watching me leave. But there was nothing. Just the dark silhouette of the cabin, growing smaller and smaller in the distance. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, where I found a small motel and checked in for the night. I spent the rest of the evening trying to convince myself that it had all been in my head. Maybe I had imagined the footsteps. Maybe the sounds were just the cabin settling, like old houses do. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something or someone had been in that cabin with me. And whatever it wasn't human. I never went back to Hollow Creek. I left a brief message for Thomas the next morning, explaining that I had to leave early due to a family emergency. He didn't question it, and I never mentioned what had happened. I didn't want to know if anyone else had experienced the same thing. All I know is that I will never book a secluded Airbnb again. I had heard so many great things about Willow Ridge. Tucked away in the scenic hills of Vermont, this Airbnb was highly rated for its stunning views, its peaceful atmosphere, and its charming, vintage architecture. After a stressful few months, at work, I decided it was time to take a break, and Willow Ridge seemed like the perfect escape. The host, Emily, was highly regarded in the reviews, praised for her attentiveness and the thoughtful little touches she left for her guests. I arrived at the house just as dusk was settling in. The late summer sun bathed the hills in a warm golden light, and the gravel driveway crunched under the tires of my car as I pulled up in front of the large, two-story house. It was an old farmhouse, probably built in the late 1800s or early 1900s, and it looked like it had been meticulously restored. A large porch wrapped around the front, and ivy clung to the sides of the house, giving it an even older, almost Gothic look. I stepped out of the car and stretched, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to melt away as I took in the peaceful surroundings. There wasn't another house in sight, just rolling hills and dense woods. It was exactly what I needed. Grabbing my bags, I made my way to the front door and let myself in with the key that Emily had left in a lockbox. Inside, the house was just as charming as the photos had promised. The floors creaked underfoot as I walked through the large, open living room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and vintage furniture was arranged in a way that felt both stylish and comfortable. The kitchen was quaint, but fully equipped, with a wooden farmhouse table sitting in the center of the room. The whole house had a welcoming, lived-in feel. Emily had left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter, welcoming me to Willow Ridge and letting me know that if I needed anything, she was just a phone call away. She also mentioned that the nearest town was about a 20-minute drive, and that the house was stocked with all the essentials. I smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for her thoughtfulness, and set my bags down in the hallway. I decided to explore the house before settling in. The ground floor had a cozy study filled with books, a dining room with a massive oak table, and a screened-in porch overlooking the backyard. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms, each more charming than the last. I chose the largest room, which had a king-sized bed, a clawfoot bathtub, and a window that offered a spectacular view of the rolling hills. After unpacking and changing into something more comfortable, I made myself a cup of tea and took it out to the porch. The sun had almost completely set by now, and the sky was painted with hues of pink and purple. I sat in one of the old wicker chairs, sipping my tea and letting the stillness of the place wash over me. It was so quiet, so peaceful. As night fell, I decided to head inside and relax with a book. I curled up in front of the fireplace, the only sound the crackling of the logs as they burned. I felt a deep sense of contentment, the kind you only get when you're far away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. It must have been close to midnight when I decided to head up to bed. I had just finished brushing my teeth when I heard something, a soft thudding sound, almost like someone walking down the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze, my toothbrush still in my hand, and listened intently. Thud, thud, thud. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the hallway to the other. My heart began to race. I was the only one in the house. Or at least, I was supposed to be. I cautiously stepped out of the bathroom and into the bedroom, my eyes darting to the door. The hallway was dark, but the soft thud of footsteps continued. They stopped right outside my door. For a moment I stood there, completely still, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the old house was just settling. But then the doorknob slowly began to turn. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. The knob twisted back and forth, as if someone on the other side was trying to open the door. But it was locked, and after a few moments, the turning stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, trembling, unsure of what to do. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and checked for service. Of course, there was none. The house was too far out in the country to get a reliable signal. I cursed under my breath and glanced toward the door, half expecting it to swing open. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to approach the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening intently. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no sound of breathing, just silence. Slowly, I unlocked the door and pulled it open, peering into the dark hallway. It was empty. I exhaled, the tension in my body releasing just a little. Maybe it had been my imagination after all. Maybe the old house had creaked, in just the right way to sound like footsteps. But as I turned to head back to bed, I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just outside one of the other bedrooms, stood a figure. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and its body was shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out any features, just the vague outline of a person standing perfectly still. A cold wave of fear washed over me. My legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, or at least, I assumed, it was watching me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel its gaze. I slowly backed into my room, not daring to take my eyes off the figure. As I did, it began to move, slowly, deliberately, taking one step after another toward me. Panic surged through me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. For the next few minutes I stood there, pressing my back against the door, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The footsteps in the hallway stopped again, just outside my room. But this time, the doorknob didn't turn. There was only silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on the bed, my phone clutched in my hands, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the figure didn't return. Eventually the sun began to rise, casting pale light through the window, and I breathed a small sigh of relief. As soon as it was light enough, I packed my things and left. I didn't bother to call Emily, didn't leave a note. I just got in my car and drove as fast as I could, my heart still racing from the events of the night before. I never figured out who or what that figure was. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it must have been a trick of the light or my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was someone in that house with me. When I finally got back home, I did a little research. Willow Ridge had been in Emily's family for generations, and as I dug deeper, I found an old newspaper article from the 1920s about a man who had disappeared while staying there. He was last seen checking into the farmhouse, but no one ever saw him leave. The locals called him the Forgotten Guest, and his body was never found. I haven't been back to Willow Ridge since, and I don't plan to. No matter how beautiful the view or how peaceful the surroundings, there's something dark in that house, and I'm not willing to find out what it is. I still wonder, though, who or what was standing in that hallway watching me as I slept. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I can still hear those slow, deliberate footsteps echoing in my mind. It was a Friday night, and I was exhausted. After working a double shift at the restaurant, I was ready to crash. I wasn't even going to accept another fare, but as I was about to log off the Uber app, a ride request popped up. It was only A few minutes away, and the destination was within the city limits, so I figured, why not? A few extra bucks wouldn't hurt. The pickup location was in a part of town I wasn't too familiar with, a mostly residential area with narrow streets, lined with old houses. It wasn't sketchy, just quiet, too quiet for a Friday night. As I pulled up to the address, I couldn't help but notice the lack of lights in any of the nearby homes. No porch lights, no windows glowing with TVs flickering inside. It was as if the whole street was asleep. The app said my passenger's name was Jacob, and he had a 4.9 star rating, so I didn't think much of it. I tapped arrived and waited. A few minutes passed, but no one came out. I sighed, glancing at the clock on my dashboard. It was just past midnight. I gave it another minute before I tapped contact on the app and called the number. "Hey, this is your Uber driver," I said, when the line picked up. "I'm outside at the address you put in, just wondering if you're still coming." For a moment, there was nothing but static on the other end. I thought maybe the call had dropped, but then I heard it, a faint voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded distant, muffled. "Hello, Jacob? Can you hear me?" More static. Then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard a single word. "Coming." I waited another minute, eyes scanning the dimly lit street. Still no sign of anyone. I considered cancelling the ride, but something held me back. Maybe it was the weirdness of the whole situation, or just my exhaustion making me overly curious, but I stayed put, and then I saw him. A figure appeared from one of the side streets, walking slowly toward the car. He was tall and thin, wearing a black hoodie with the hood pulled up, his face obscured by the shadows. I unlocked the doors as he approached, glancing at the rearview mirror as he opened the back door and slid into the seat behind me. "Jacob?" I asked, turning slightly. He didn't respond at first. He just sat there, still, as if waiting for something. I felt a chill run down my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Jacob?" I asked again, a little more cautiously this time. Finally, he spoke. "Yeah, let's go." There was something off about his voice, low, raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. But I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just tired, or drunk, or both. Either way, I started the car and headed toward the destination he'd put into the app. It wasn't far, just a 20-minute drive to a neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The ride started in silence, the only sounds being the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of static from my radio, which had been acting up lately. I stole a glance in the rearview mirror, but Jacob had his hood up, his face turned toward the window. He didn't seem interested in making conversation, which was fine by me. I wasn't in the mood for small talk either. As we drove, I started to notice something strange. The streets we were passing through seemed eerily deserted. Sure, it was late, but there were usually at least a few cars out, especially on a weekend. But tonight, it was just us. No cars, no pedestrians, nothing. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease creeping up on me, focusing instead on the road ahead. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my stomach drop. We were driving past an intersection when I glanced at one of the side streets. Standing there, in the middle of the road, was a figure, tall, thin, wearing a black hoodie, exactly like Jacob. I blinked, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. It couldn't be. Jacob was in the car, sitting right behind me, but when I glanced in the rearview mirror, he was still there, silent, staring out the window. My heart pounded in my chest, and I quickly turned my eyes back to the road. I must have imagined it. That was the only explanation. I was tired, my eyes were playing tricks on me. That had to be it. But a few minutes later, it happened again. Another figure, standing at the corner of a street we passed, tall and thin, dressed in a black hoodie. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, but Jacob was still there, as still as a statue. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice shaky. Jacob didn't respond. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my focus on the road, but the feeling of dread was becoming impossible to ignore. Something was wrong. Very wrong. We were getting closer to the destination now, a few minutes away, but I was seriously considering pulling over and ending the ride. I didn't care about the rating or the money at this point. I just wanted this night to be over. And then, as we turned onto a narrow, deserted street, Jacob finally spoke. "You've seen them, haven't you?" His voice sent a shiver down my spine. It was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Seen who?" I stammered. "The others," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "They're watching." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My hands were shaking, and I could barely keep my eyes on the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, but Jacob's face was still obscured by the hood. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Jacob didn't respond, but I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see his face. The air in the car felt heavy, suffocating, and the silence was unbearable. We were just a block away from the destination now. I couldn't wait to drop him off and get the hell out of there. But as we approached the address, my stomach sank. The destination was a dead end. The road led to an old, abandoned lot, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by rusting chain link fences. There were no houses, no buildings, just an empty, desolate space. My headlights illuminated the lot, casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. "This is it," Jacob said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I slammed on the brakes, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My heart was racing and my mind was screaming at me to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But before I could say anything, Jacob leaned forward, close enough that I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. "There." "Here," he whispered. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. Jacob was no longer in his seat. The back of the car was empty. I froze, my mind reeling. He had been there just a second ago. I had heard him speak, felt his presence. But now there was nothing. No sign that anyone had been in the car at all. I whipped my head around, scanning the lot, my eyes wide with terror. And that's when I saw them. Dozens of figures, tall and thin, all dressed in black hoodies, standing in the shadows at the edge of the lot. They were motionless, their faces hidden, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. Panic surged through me. I slammed the car into reverse and hit the gas, my tires screeching as I sped backward down the narrow street. I didn't stop until I was miles away, my heart still pounding in my chest. I never saw Jacob again. I reported the incident to Uber, but they said the ride had never been completed. According to their records, no one had ever gotten into my car that night. I've tried to put it behind me, to tell myself it was just a bad dream, a hallucination, brought on by exhaustion. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through the city, I'll catch a glimpse of a tall, thin figure in a black hoodie standing at the corner of a street. And I know they're still watching. It was around 11 p.m. when I accepted the ride. My night had been slow, barely making any money, so I figured one last fare might help me close out the night on a decent note. The location was about 10 minutes away, and the destination wasn't too far off from where I lived. I was already picturing myself pulling into my driveway after the drop off and collapsing into bed. Little did I know that was the last thing I would be doing that night. The pickup was in a residential area, an older part of the city where the streets were narrow and lined with brick houses that seemed to loom over you, even in the dark. I didn't mind driving through there usually. The speed limits were low, and it was a peaceful area. But tonight, something felt different. It was unusually quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you double, check your doors are locked. I pulled up to the address the app had given me. It was a large, 2-story house, with no lights on, not even a porch light to guide my way. I frowned. Most people at least leave a light on if they're expecting a ride. I double-checked the address on the app to make sure I was in the right place. Yep, this is it, I muttered to myself. I tapped Arrived in the app and waited, glancing at the house again, still no sign of anyone. After about a minute, I called the passenger through the app. "Hey, this is your Uber driver," I said, when the call connected. "I'm outside. Are you still coming?" For a moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end. I checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard a faint voice. It was so soft I had to strain to hear it. "I'm coming." The voice sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded odd, like whoever was speaking was far away, even though they were supposedly right there in the house. I chalked it up to a bad connection and hung up, waiting for the passenger to appear. A minute passed, then another. I was just about to cancel the ride when I saw movement. A figure stepped out of the front door, their form barely visible in the dim light from the street lamp down the block. They were tall, dressed in a long coat with the collar turned up, and they moved with an odd stiffness, almost like they were unsure of their own steps. I watched as the figure walked slowly down the front steps and made their way toward the car. My instincts were screaming at me that something wasn't right, but I brushed it off. It was late, and I was tired. Maybe the passenger was just drunk or tired too. They reached the car and opened the back door, sliding into the seat behind me. I glanced into the rearview mirror, but the collar of their coat was pulled up high, obscuring most of their face. All I could see was the top of their head, their hair dark and slightly messy. "Evening," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Where are we heading?" The passenger didn't answer right away. Instead, they shifted slightly in their seat, like they were getting comfortable. The silence stretched on for a few uncomfortable seconds before they finally spoke. "The old theater," they said quietly. I paused, frowning. "The old theater? You mean the one that's been closed for years?" "Yes," the passenger replied, their voice soft but firm. "That one." My gut twisted. The old theater had been shut down for over a decade, and it was nothing more than a crumbling building now. There was no reason anyone would want to go there, especially at this time of night. But I didn't question it. Maybe they were some kind of urban explorer, or maybe they just liked weird, abandoned places. People did strange things sometimes. "All right," I said, pulling up the destination on my GPS. "Let's go." As we drove, the passenger remained completely silent. I kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror, but they didn't move or say anything. They just sat there, staring straight ahead. I tried to shake off the creeping feeling of unease, focusing on the road instead. The route to the theater took us through some winding back streets. the kind that didn't get much traffic even during the day. At night, they were almost completely deserted. The streetlights were few and far between, leaving long stretches of darkness in between the pools of yellow light. About halfway there, I noticed something strange. Every time we passed under a streetlight, the passenger's reflection in the rearview mirror would momentarily disappear. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but the more it happened, the more unnerving it became. I kept my eyes on the road, trying not to think about it, but my heart was racing in my chest. We were getting close to the theatre now. The road ahead was pitch black, and the crumbling building loomed in the distance, its once grand facade now covered in graffiti and vines. I pulled up to the curb and parked the car, the theatre's dark entrance just a few yards away. "We're here," I said, turning slightly to look at the passenger. "This is the..." The back seat was empty. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The passenger, who had been sitting there just moments ago, was gone. The door hadn't opened, and I hadn't heard any movement. They had simply vanished. Panic surged through me. I twisted around in my seat, my eyes scanning the back of the car. There was no sign of them, no sign that anyone had ever been there. My hands were shaking, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I looked out the window toward the theatre. The building stood silent and imposing, its broken windows like dark, empty eyes staring back at me. My stomach churned as a wave of nausea hit me. I didn't know what had just happened, but I needed to get out of there. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in the well-lit part of town where there were people and noise and life. When I finally pulled over, I checked the app, expecting to see that the ride had been cancelled or completed. But when I looked, the trip was still active. According to the app, I hadn't dropped off my passenger yet. My hands were trembling as I hit the end trip button, but instead of the usual confirmation, an error message popped up. Unable to end trip. Please try again. I stared at the screen, my pulse racing. I tried again. Same message. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the passenger sitting there again, but the back seat was still empty. I tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt thick, like something was pressing down on my chest. I opened the app again and tried to contact the passenger. Maybe there was some glitch in the system, something I could clear up if I just spoke to them. But when I dialed the number listed in the app, the call didn't go through. Instead, I got a strange message. This number is no longer in service. My heart sank. I tried to remember the passenger's name, but for the life of me, I couldn't. I had seen it when I first accepted the ride, but now it was like the memory had been wiped clean. I couldn't even recall what they had looked like, other than the coat and the dark hair. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see the passenger sitting there, watching me with those unseen eyes. The next day, I contacted Uber support, explaining the situation. They checked their records, but according to them, no such ride had ever been logged in the system. There was no record of me picking up or dropping off anyone at that location. I've since stopped driving for Uber at night. I can't shake the memory of that empty back seat or the way the passenger just disappeared. Sometimes late at night, when I'm driving through the city, I feel a cold chill run down my spine, and I find myself glancing in the rearview mirror just to make sure I'm still alone, because something tells me that passenger never really left. It was a chilly autumn night, and the wind whistled through the cracks in my car windows as I drove through the dimly lit streets of my town. The roads were deserted, save for a few late night stragglers making their way home after a long day. It was the kind of night that made you want to curl up in bed, but I was out here driving, trying to make ends meet. Uber driving wasn't glamorous, but it helped pay the bills. I had already dropped off a couple of passengers and was debating whether to head home or do one last ride for the night. My back ached from sitting in the driver's seat for hours, and my eyes were beginning to feel heavy. But as I glanced at my phone, a new ride request popped up, and instinctively I accepted it. The pickup location was only a few minutes away, on the outskirts of town near the highway. Not many people lived out there, and those who did were mostly tucked away in large, isolated houses or farms. As I made my way toward the location, I couldn't shake a sense of unease that had settled in my chest. Maybe it was the late hour, or maybe it was the fact that I rarely got ride requests from this part of town. I pulled up to the address on the app, a narrow gravel driveway leading into the darkness. There were no streetlights, no sign of any house, just a long stretch of road disappearing into the trees. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should drive further in, but the app confirmed I had arrived. I glanced around, expecting to see someone waiting by the side of the road, but there was no one. I tapped the arrived button on the app and waited. A few seconds passed, and I considered calling the passenger. Maybe they were inside or hadn't noticed I was there. Just as I reached for my phone, I saw movement in the distance. A figure was walking toward the car from the direction of the driveway, slowly making their way through the shadows. The person was tall, wearing a long coat that flapped in the wind and a wide-brimmed hat that cast their face in shadow. There was something off about their gait, something too deliberate, too controlled. My instincts were screaming at me that something wasn't right, but I was already there, and I couldn't just drive off without reason. The figure reached the passenger side of the car, and without a word, they opened the back door and got in. The interior lights briefly illuminated their face, but I only caught a glimpse. It was a man, pale and gaunt, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to glint in the dim light. His expression was emotionless, almost lifeless, as he settled into the seat behind me. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound cheerful, though the unease in my voice was evident. The man didn't respond. Instead, he simply stared out the window, his face half hidden in the shadows. I cleared my throat and looked back at my phone, checking the destination. To my surprise, there wasn't one listed. It was rare, but sometimes passengers forgot to enter where they wanted to go. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, in a voice so low and soft that I almost didn't hear him, he said, "Just drive." I frowned. "Just drive? Do you have a specific place in mind?" Again, he was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned forward slightly, just enough for me to see the edge of his hat in the mirror. "You'll know when we get there." That sent a shiver down my spine. I had encountered strange passengers before, but this was different. Something about this man felt wrong. I should have refused. I should have told him to get out of the car, that I wasn't going to drive aimlessly in the middle of the night for someone who couldn't give me a destination. But, against my better judgment, I put the car in gear and started driving. The road ahead was long and empty, stretching into the distance like a black ribbon under the moonlight. For the first few minutes, I tried to make conversation, but the man remained silent, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery. Every time I glanced at him through the mirror, I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. "Are you from around here?" I asked. my voice sounding more nervous than I intended. The man didn't respond. I tried again. "It's a quiet night, huh? Not much traffic." Still nothing. I sighed and decided to give up on small talk. Some passengers just didn't like to chat, and that was fine. But the further we drove, the more the tension in the car seemed to grow. It was like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. The road stretched on, and the familiar streets of town began to disappear, replaced by open fields and patches of dense woods. After what felt like an eternity of driving in silence, I noticed something strange. We had been on the same road for what should have been at least 20 minutes, but none of the landmarks looked familiar. I knew these roads well enough, but nothing about this route made sense. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches arching over the road like skeletal arms, and the moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above. I checked my phone for the GPS, but it was frozen. The app had stopped updating, and the location was stuck in place as if we hadn't moved at all. I tapped the screen trying to get it to work, but nothing happened. "Are we going the right way?" I asked, glancing at the man again. This time he spoke. "We're almost there." There was a finality to his words, a certainty that sent another chill down my spine. I didn't know where there was, but I had a sinking feeling that I didn't want to find out. The road narrowed further, the trees growing thicker on either side until we were driving through what felt like a tunnel of darkness. The headlights barely cut through the gloom, and I had to slow down to avoid hitting any stray branches that jutted out onto the road. Just as I was about to stop the car and demand the man tell me where we were going, the road opened up into a clearing. It was an old, overgrown parking lot, cracked and broken from years of neglect. At the far end of the lot stood a building, long abandoned and covered in ivy. The windows were boarded up, and the roof sagged in places, giving it a decrepit, haunted appearance. "We're here," the man said softly. I looked at him in the rearview mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is this place?" He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door and stepped out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were taking his time. I watched as he walked toward the building, disappearing into the shadows that surrounded it. For a moment, I sat there, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to drive away, to leave this place and never look back. But another part of me was curious, compelled to see what this man was doing here, in the middle of the night, at an abandoned building in the middle of nowhere. Against my better judgment, I got out of the car and followed him. The air was cold, and the wind howled through the trees, making the whole place feel even more desolate. As I approached the building, I saw that the front door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the wind. The man had disappeared inside, and I hesitated for a moment before stepping through the door. Inside, the building was even more decrepit than I had imagined. The floor was covered in dust and debris, and the walls were cracked and peeling. I could barely see anything in the dim light, but I could hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps led me to a large room at the back of the building. The ceiling had partially collapsed, allowing moonlight to filter through the cracks, casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the center of the room stood the man, his back to me as he stared at something on the ground. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat as I saw what he was looking at. On the floor, partially buried under debris, was a large, weathered gravestone. The inscription was barely legible, but I could make out a name and a date. It was an old grave, long forgotten and neglected. The man knelt down beside the grave, his hand gently brushing away the dirt and debris that covered it. For a moment, he was still, as if lost in thought. Then, without warning, he turned to look at me, his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "This is where it ends," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't understand what he meant, but before I could react, the man stood up and walked toward me. His expression was calm, almost serene, but there was something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. I backed away, my heart racing as I stumbled toward the door. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, sprinting back to the car as fast as I could. As I reached the car and slammed the door shut, I glanced back at the building. The man was gone. There was no sign of him, no sign that he had ever been there. I didn't waste any time. I started the car and sped off, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The road was still dark and winding, but I didn't care. I just wanted to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. It wasn't until I was miles away back on familiar streets that I finally allowed myself to breathe. My phone buzzed and I glanced at the screen. The ride had ended and the fare had been paid, but when I checked the passenger details, the name was gone. There was no record of the man in the app, no history of the ride. It was as if he had never existed. To this day, I don't know who that man was or why he led me to that abandoned building. But I'll never forget the look in his eyes, the cold, lifeless expression as he knelt beside that grave. And I'll never drive out to the outskirts of town again, no matter how much money Uber offers me. It was one of those nights where the city seemed to hum with an undercurrent of unease. I'd been driving for hours, the monotonous routine of Uber rides blending together, and I was just about ready to call it quits. My phone was in its holder, waiting for one last ride before I could head home. The clock ticked past midnight, and the streets had quieted down, save for the occasional drunk stumbling out of a bar or a late night commuter rushing home. I wasn't expecting much more than a quick ride, but the notification that pinged my phone made me pause. A new ride request popped up. The pickup was in a part of town I usually avoided, the industrial zone near the city's edge, a place with dilapidated warehouses and factories long abandoned. But it was late, and I figured it'd be an easy fare to finish off the night. The address was a good 10 minutes away, and as I made my way there, the streets gradually emptied out. The flickering streetlights cast long, eerie shadows, and I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread settling in my gut. Something about this ride felt off, but I brushed it aside. Maybe I was just tired, my nerves getting the best of me. I pulled up in front of a large, old warehouse. It looked like it hadn't been in use for years. The windows were boarded up, and the walls were covered in graffiti, but the app confirmed that this was the pickup location. I glanced around, expecting to see someone waiting by the entrance, but there was no one. I checked the ride details on my phone. The name was David, a pretty common name, and the profile picture was just a grey silhouette, nothing to set off any alarms. Still, something didn't sit right with me. I tapped the arrived button and waited. Minutes passed, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The quiet around me felt oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. I was about to cancel the ride and leave when a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and thin, walked slowly toward the car. His face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, and his gait was uneven, almost like he was limping. I watched him approach, feeling my stomach tighten. There was something off about the way he moved, like he wasn't quite in control of his own body. Still, I'd already committed to the ride, and I wasn't about to cancel now. The man opened the passenger door and slid into the back seat without saying a word. I glanced at him through the rearview mirror, trying to get a better look at his face, but his hood was pulled too low to see anything clearly. "Good evening," I said, hoping to break the tension. He didn't respond. His silence hung heavy in the air, and I cleared my throat awkwardly. "Where are you headed?" For a long moment he said nothing. I was about to repeat the question when his voice, low and raspy, finally broke the silence. "Just drive," he said. "I'll tell you when to stop." That was the first red flag. Uber passengers always had a destination in mind, or at least an address to input into the app. But this guy wasn't offering anything specific, and the way he spoke, it didn't sit right with me. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the gear shift, wondering if I should just tell him I couldn't do the ride and call it a night. But something kept me from refusing. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was stupidity, or maybe it was the fact that his voice had an edge of something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Desperation? Reluctantly, I put the car in drive and pulled away from the warehouse, the empty street stretching out in front of us like an endless labyrinth. The man in the back seat was completely silent, and the tension grew thicker with every passing minute. As we drove, the city around us began to change. The tall buildings and lit-up streets slowly gave way to darker, more desolate areas. We passed through neighborhoods I hadn't been to in years, places where the streetlights barely worked, and the houses looked abandoned, their windows boarded up, just like the warehouse. "Keep going," the man finally said, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. I followed his instructions, driving deeper into the city's outskirts. We were heading toward a part of town I didn't recognize, a place that seemed forgotten by time. The streets were narrow and winding, with tall trees on either side, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out the moonlight. It was pitch dark, and I had to rely on my headlights to see the road in front of me. We must have been driving for over 30 minutes when the man finally spoke again. "Turn." "Here," he said, his voice sharper this time, more urgent. I turned onto a narrow dirt road, the tires crunching on the gravel as the car bounced slightly over the uneven surface. There were no houses here, no signs of civilization, just a long, dark road that seemed to lead into the middle of nowhere. "Ah, you sure this is the right way?" I asked, unable to hide the nervous edge in my voice. He didn't respond, and I glanced at him in the mirror again. This time I could see his face more clearly. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were wide, unblinking, staring straight ahead. There was something wrong with him, something that made my pulse quicken in fear, but I didn't stop. I just kept driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. After what felt like an eternity, the man spoke again. "Stop the car." I did as he said, pulling over to the side of the road. There was nothing around us but trees and darkness. No buildings, no lights, no signs of life. I turned off the engine, and the silence that followed was deafening. The man didn't move. He just sat there, staring out the window, his breathing slow and shallow. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins. Something was very, very wrong. Suddenly, he turned to look at me, his eyes locking onto mine through the rearview mirror. "Get out of the car," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Why did he want me to get out? What was he planning? Fear gripped me, but I knew I had to keep my composure. I couldn't let him see how terrified I was. I'm not sure I can do that, I said, my voice trembling slightly. His expression didn't change. Get out, he repeated more forcefully this time. Every instinct in my body was telling me to run, to drive away as fast as I could, but I couldn't move. It was like my body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The man reached into his jacket, and for a brief moment, I thought he was going to pull out a weapon. My heart skipped a beat, and I braced myself for the worst. But instead, he pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He held it out toward me, his hand shaking slightly. "Take this," he said, his voice cracking. I stared at the paper, unsure of what to do. My mind was screaming at me to leave, to get as far away from this man as possible. But there was something in his eyes, something desperate, that made me reach out and take the paper from his hand. The moment I touched it, he let out a deep, shuddering breath, like he had been holding it in for a long time. He slumped back in his seat, his body going limp, and for a moment I thought he had passed out. I unfolded the paper, my hands trembling as I held it up to the light from my phone. The handwriting was shaky and barely legible, but I could make out the words, "I need you to help me, they're coming." Before I could react, the man bolted upright in his seat, his eyes wide with terror. "They're here," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. I turned around in my seat, my heart racing. The road behind us was empty, but I could feel it too, a presence, something watching us from the darkness. The air around us felt heavy, suffocating, and a cold chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean? Who's coming?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. But the man didn't answer. He was already scrambling to get out of the car, his movements frantic. "We need to go," he shouted, his voice filled with panic. I didn't wait for him to explain. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped down the dirt road, the tires kicking up gravel as the car lurched forward. The man was panting heavily in the back seat, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows at any moment. I drove as fast as I could, the trees blurring past us, but no matter how far we went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or some shadowy figure chasing after us, but there was nothing. After what felt like an eternity, the road finally opened up, and we emerged from the forest onto a main highway. The city lights were visible in the distance, and the tension in my chest began to ease. But the man in the back seat was still shaking, his eyes wide with fear. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. He didn't respond at first, just stared out the window as if in a daze. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for helping me." I wanted to ask him more. Who was after him? What had happened? But I could tell he wasn't in any state to talk. Instead, I drove in silence, the city lights growing brighter as we approached civilization once more. I dropped him off at a gas station just outside the city, where he quickly disappeared into the night without another word. I sat there for a long moment, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When I finally opened the app to end the ride, I noticed something strange. There was no record of the trip. No fare, no name, nothing. It was as if the man had never existed. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he was running from, but I'll never forget the look of terror in his eyes, the desperation in his voice, and I'll never take a ride from the outskirts of town again. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the city was blanketed in darkness as I navigated my Uber through the late night streets. I had just dropped off a group of college kids at a party, and as I glanced at the clock, I realized it was already past midnight. My plan was to call it a night after one last fare, a way to cap off an uneventful evening. I pulled into a nearby parking lot to wait for the next ride request. Business had been slow, so I wasn't expecting anything too exciting. The dim glow from my phone was the only source of light as I scrolled mindlessly, waiting for a notification. The soft pings of text messages from friends telling me about their own plans for the weekend barely registered in my mind. Then, the Uber app buzzed. A new ride request popped up. I glanced at the screen and hesitated for a second. The pickup location was listed as a remote part of town, far out on the outskirts, a place I rarely went, especially this late at night. The address seemed odd, a random spot on a highway with no residential areas nearby, but I figured it was probably someone stranded after a night out. Against my better judgment, I accepted the ride. It was late, and I told myself it would be a quick trip. As I punched the coordinates into my GPS and started driving, a nagging feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. The streets grew quieter as I drove further from the city. The buildings thinned out, replaced by dark stretches of road, flanked by tall trees on either side. The glow from the streetlights became scarce until it was just me, the hum of my car, engine, and the winding road ahead. After about 20 minutes of driving, I neared the destination, a desolate stretch of road with no signs of life in sight. My headlights swept across the empty highway as I slowed down, searching for any indication of a passenger. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing near the edge of the road. It was a man dressed in a long coat, with his face partially obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He was standing perfectly still, not waving or signaling like most passengers would. Just standing there, watching. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to shake it off. It was probably nothing. Maybe he was just cold, waiting for me to pull over. I slowed the car to a stop in front of him and rolled down the window slightly. "Are you the Uber for Charlie?" I asked, glancing at the name on my app. The man didn't answer right away. He simply stood there, his face still hidden by the shadows. After what felt like an eternity, he finally nodded and took a step toward the car. I unlocked the door, my fingers hesitating on the button for a split second, but the sound of the door unlocking was unmistakable. Without a word, the man opened the back door and slid into the seat behind me. "Where are we headed?" I asked, trying to maintain a calm tone, but something about his silence unnerved me. "Just drive," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. A wave of unease washed over me. There was something off about his voice. It was low and raspy, almost like it hadn't been used in a long time. But I shrugged it off and started driving, following the GPS directions. As instructed, the highway stretched out before us, empty and quiet, with only the occasional flicker of headlights from a distant car. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man hadn't said a word since he got in, and the atmosphere in the car felt heavy, like the air had grown thicker. After a few minutes, I decided to break the silence. "So, you heading home?" The man didn't respond. I glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to catch a glimpse of his face, but he was sitting in the far corner of the back seat, his head turned away from me. His coat was draped over his lap, and his hands rested calmly on his knees. The brim of his hat cast a deep shadow over his features, making it impossible to see his expression. "Do you live around here?" I asked, trying again to make conversation. "Just keep driving," he said quietly, his voice carrying that same unsettling rasp. Something wasn't right. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, to stop the car and kick him out, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It was as if a force beyond my control was compelling me to keep going. The road became narrower as we left the main highway and entered a rural area. The trees on either side of the road grew denser, their branches intertwining above us, blocking out the moonlight. The darkness felt suffocating, and the only light came from my headlights, illuminating the narrow path ahead. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel. The GPS showed that we were headed deeper into the countryside, miles away from any towns or houses. A sense of dread settled in my chest as I realized that I had no idea where this man was taking me. Suddenly the man spoke again. "Turn left up ahead," he said, his voice a low growl. I glanced at the GPS in confusion. There was no left turn marked on the map, just a straight road that led further into the woods. My heartbeat quickened as I debated whether to follow his instructions or not. "There's no road here," I said, my voice faltering slightly. "Turn left," he repeated more forcefully this time. Against my better judgment, I slowed the car and looked around. Sure enough, there was a narrow dirt path branching off from the main road, barely visible through the thick underbrush. The path wasn't on any map, and it looked like it hadn't been used in years. But before I could argue, the man leaned forward slightly and I caught a glimpse of his eyes in the rear-view mirror, cold, piercing, and completely devoid of emotion. My breath caught in my throat, and I knew I had no choice. I turned onto the dirt path. The car jolted as we made our way down the uneven road, the trees closing in around us like a tunnel. The farther we went, the more the sense of dread grew. I glanced in the rear-view mirror again, but the man had leaned back into the shadows, his face once again hidden. My pulse raced as I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to keep my focus on the road ahead. But something was wrong. Indeed, further we drove, the more the world around us seemed to change. The trees looked darker, more twisted, and the air felt thick and heavy like we were driving through a dream. "Stop the car!" the man suddenly commanded, his voice a sharp hiss. I slammed on the brakes and the car came to a jarring halt. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited, unsure of what was going to happen next. The man didn't move for a long moment and the silence was suffocating. Then, slowly, he opened the door and stepped out of the car. He stood there for a moment, staring into the woods, before turning back to face me. "Don't follow me," he said quietly, his voice dripping with menace. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the trees, his figure swallowed by the darkness. I sat there, frozen in place, my mind racing. What had just happened? Where was he going? And why had he taken me all the way out here? My first instinct was to drive away, to get as far from this place as possible. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened the car door and stepped out, glancing around nervously. The air was cold, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. I took a few hesitant steps toward the tree line, my heart hammering in my chest. But as soon as I crossed the threshold of the trees, a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. It was as if the very air had changed, growing colder and more oppressive. I stopped in my tracks, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn back. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere deep in the woods. My blood ran cold as the sound grew louder, more menacing. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. I turned and bolted back to the car, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction and speeding down the path. As I drove, I could feel it. Something was following me. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, too afraid of what I might see, but I could hear it, the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, keeping pace with the car. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my heart pounding in my chest. Only then did I glance in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything, chasing me. But there was nothing. The man was gone. The thing in the woods was gone. And the road behind me was empty. I don't know what happened that night or who that man was, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes, the cold, emotionless stare that sent chills down my spine. I've never taken a fare from the outskirts of town again. Hospitals have always made me uneasy. Even after working in one for years, I couldn't shake the discomfort of the dimly lit halls, the sterile smell of disinfectant, and the eerie quiet of the night shifts. But St. Mary's Memorial Hospital was different. There was something darker lurking within its walls, something more sinister than the usual dread hospitals tend to evoke. I'd been working there for about 6 months, taking the night shift as a part-time nurse to pay off some debts. The pay was decent, but I hated being there after midnight. Most of the time it was quiet. Too quiet. The hospital seemed to fall into a kind of eerie stillness after the day staff left. Even the patients seemed to sleep more deeply, as if the darkness itself pressed down on them. It didn't take long for me to hear the stories from the other night nurses. Everyone talked about the East Wing. It was old, abandoned, and scheduled for renovation. But that hadn't stopped the rumors from spreading. People said they'd heard strange noises coming from that part of the building. Voices, footsteps, the sound of wheels rolling down the empty halls. The East Wing had been closed down for years, ever since a fire gutted most of the structure, leaving it charred and unsafe for patients. Despite the rumors, I always dismissed the stories as just that, stories, until one night when I had to experience the East Wing for myself. It was a particularly slow shift, and the other nurses were taking their breaks. I was charting in one of the empty rooms when the intercom crackled to life, the sudden noise startling me. Usually, it was the charge nurse calling for someone or checking on a patient, but this time, the voice that came through was unfamiliar. "Can someone please come to room 512 in the East Wing?" The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but there was a distinct urgency to it. I froze, my pen halfway across the paper. Room 512 was in the East Wing, an area no one had entered in years. I assumed it had to be some kind of mistake, maybe an old recording or a glitch in the system. But then the voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Please, I need help in room 512. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the intercom, the static buzzing softly. It couldn't be real, I thought. There was no one in the East Wing. No one had been in there since the fire. And yet, something in the voice, it sounded so desperate, so frightened. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and made my way toward the East Wing. The hospital was mostly dark now, the only light coming from the occasional flickering overhead bulb. The East Wing had been sealed off with yellow caution. Tape, the doors padlocked to keep people out, but the door to the wing was slightly ajar when I arrived. I hesitated. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to call someone else, but my curiosity, or maybe my sense of duty, overruled the fear. I pushed the door open and stepped into the hallway. The air in the East Wing was different, stale and cold, like the place had been untouched for years. The walls were blackened from the fire, the ceiling tiles sagging and broken. My footsteps echoed unnervingly in the stillness as I made my way down the hall, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The numbers on the doors were faded, but I knew I was getting closer to room 512. I passed room 508, then 510. The door to room 512 stood slightly open, just enough for me to see inside. I swallowed hard and pushed the door the rest of the way open, shining my flashlight into the room. It was empty. No bed, no medical equipment, no signs that anyone had been in there for years. The walls were scorched black, the window shattered, letting in a cold breeze. Dust swirled in the beam of my flashlight as I stood frozen in the doorway, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I heard it. A faint, shuffling sound like footsteps coming from behind me. I whipped around, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the walls of the empty hallway, but it was nothing. Just the dark, silent corridor stretching out in both directions. My heart raced as I turned back to the room, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, barely visible at first, but growing clearer as it moved toward me. It wasn't the shadow of a person, though. It was something darker, something more twisted. It didn't seem to walk, it glided, its form shifting and flickering like a candle flame. I stepped back instinctively, my breath catching in my throat as the shadow approached. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, my breath visible in the cold air. "Help me!" The voice came again, but this time it wasn't over the intercom. It was right there, in the room with me. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and I screamed, dropping my flashlight as I stumbled backward. The beam of light rolled across the floor, illuminating the twisted, blackened figure that stood before me. Its face was a charred ruin, its eyes hollow, and its mouth stretched, open in a soundless scream. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was back in the main part of the hospital, my heart pounding in my chest. My co-workers looked up as I burst through the doors, my face pale and my hands shaking. "What happened?" one of the nurses asked, concerned. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. All I could do was point back toward the East Wing, my mind still reeling from what I had just seen. That was the last time I ever set foot near the East Wing. I requested a transfer to a different floor the next day, and I never worked another night shift at St. Mary's Memorial again. But even now, years later, I still think about that night. I still hear the voice, soft and desperate, calling for help from room 512. And I still see the figure, its twisted, burned face looming in the darkness, waiting for someone to answer its call. No one else ever heard the voice, no one else ever saw the shadow, but I did, and I'll never forget it. I left St. Mary's shortly after that incident. The hospital was sold to a new owner who promised to renovate the East Wing and bring the old building back to life. But part of me wonders if they knew what they were getting into. If they knew about the things lurking in the shadows, waiting for someone to step inside. The East Wing still stands, but it remains closed off to this day. People say it's because of structural issues that it's too dangerous to enter. But I know the truth. There's something far worse than collapsing ceilings and broken windows. In that part of the hospital, something that doesn't want to be disturbed, and if you're ever at St. Mary's Memorial, walking the halls late at night, and you hear a voice calling for help from room 512, I suggest you keep walking. Some doors are better left closed. Hospitals are supposed to be places of healing where you go to get better, to recover, to find hope. At least that's what everyone believes. But after what I experienced during my time as a night nurse at Ridgeview General, I'm not so sure anymore. The truth is, not every patient gets better. Some never leave, even when they're supposed to. I had only been at Ridgeview for a few months, working the dreaded night shift like all the new hires. The hospital was old, one of those places that had seen countless renovations but still carried the weight of its history in the worn floors and dimly lit corridors. It was a quiet place during the night, with most patients asleep and only a skeleton crew of nurses and doctors on duty. Despite the emptiness, there was always a feeling of being watched, like the building itself had eyes. The shift started, like any other. We were short, staffed that night, and I was tasked with covering 2 wards instead of 1. One of them was the intensive care unit, and the other was a section of the hospital that had been mostly shut down for years. They called it the old ward. It was the part of the building that hadn't been updated in decades, with its peeling paint, flickering lights, and strange smells that seemed to cling to the air. I'd heard rumors about the old ward from some of the more seasoned nurses. They said it had once been used for terminal patients, a place where those who were beyond help were kept away from the rest of the hospital. It was out of sight, out of mind, they'd say. The patients in the old ward never made it back. I didn't think much of it at the time, chalking it up to typical hospital gossip. But that night, I learned the truth. It was around 2 a.m. when I got a call to check on a patient in the old ward. The request came through the pager system, but it didn't make sense. As far as I knew, that part of the hospital hadn't been used for patients in years. Maybe it was a mistake, a glitch in the system, I thought. Still, I grabbed my chart and made my way down to investigate. The old ward was tucked away at the end of a long corridor, separated from the rest of the hospital by a heavy metal door that creaked when it opened. The air grew colder as I stepped through, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unsettling, sickly glow. The ward itself was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed down on you, made it hard to breathe. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the empty space. The rooms were dark, the doors shut tight. But as I approached the nurses' station, I noticed something strange. There was a light on in one of the rooms. Room 316, I hesitated. There shouldn't have been anyone there. The old ward had been closed for as long as I could remember, and even when it had been in use, it was mostly for storage. Yet, here I was, standing in front of a room with the door slightly ajar, and the light spilling out into the hallway. Curiosity, and maybe a sense of duty, got the better of me. I knocked lightly on the door, not really expecting an answer. When none came, I pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. The room was empty. No bed, no patient, just an old metal chair and a set of rusty medical cabinets against the wall. The light was coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering slightly as if it were struggling to stay on. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It must have been a maintenance error, I told myself. Someone had probably forgotten to turn the light off years ago, and it had been burning ever since. I was just about to leave when I heard it. A voice. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Help me." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice had come from the corner of the room, from the shadows where the light didn't quite reach. I took a step forward, squinting to see if someone was there. Maybe a homeless person had broken in, or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I got closer, the shadows seemed to shift, and that's when I saw her. A woman, or at least what was left of her. She was sitting in the corner, her body twisted and gaunt, her skin pale and almost translucent. Her eyes were wide, staring at me with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Please," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. "Help me, I—" Stumbled back, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. There was no way someone had been living in this abandoned room for years. And yet, there she was, as real as the cold air around me. Before I could react, the light above flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me and I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. When the beam of light cut through the darkness, the woman was gone. The room was empty again, just as it had been when I first walked in. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scanned the room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was nothing. No sign of the woman, no trace that anyone had been there at all. I backed out of the room, my flashlight shaking as I hurried down the hall. The air seemed to grow colder with every step, and the shadows felt like they were closing in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was following me. By the time I reached the main part of the hospital again, I was a mess. My co-workers gave me strange looks as I stumbled into the break room, pale and sweating. "You look like you've seen a ghost," one of the nurses joked. But I couldn't bring myself to laugh. I wanted to tell them what I had seen, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. Hell, I didn't even believe myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing her face, her wide, terrified eyes staring back at me from the corner of that forgotten room. And the worst part was, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, waiting for someone to help her. I never went back to the old ward after that. I asked to be transferred to a different shift, and luckily, I got it. But sometimes late at night, I still think about that room. I wonder who she was, how she ended up there, and why no one had ever found her. Maybe she was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind in the dead of night. Or maybe she was something else entirely, something that had been left behind in the dark, forgotten corners of the hospital. Either way, I'll never forget her voice, soft and pleading, echoing in the darkness. "Help me." Years have passed since that night, but the memory of the old ward still haunts me. The hospital eventually shut down that part of the building, completely sealing it off for good, but I know that something or someone is still in there, waiting in the shadows. If you ever find yourself working the night shift at Ridgeview General, and you hear a voice calling for help from the old ward, do yourself a favor, don't answer. Some cries for help are better left unheard. It was the kind of night that made you question why you ever took up trucking. The darkness had swallowed the landscape whole, with nothing but the high beams of my Kenworth W900 cutting through the black void of Highway 76. The radio had long gone silent, and the only sounds were the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of static from the CB radio. I'd been on the road for over 12 hours and was running on fumes, both in the truck and in my own system. But I had a deadline to meet, and there was no stopping now. The job had taken me across some pretty desolate highways in my time, but Highway 76 was different. It cut through the middle of nowhere, running parallel to some forgotten mountain range, with no towns or gas stations in sight for hundreds of miles. The road was notorious among truckers. They called it the loneliest road, and after hours of driving without so much as seeing another set of headlights, I understood why. I had been hauling a shipment of construction materials from Denver to Sacramento, and I figured I'd push through the night and make it to the next truck stop before dawn. But as the clock on the dashboard ticked past midnight, I began to feel the weight of exhaustion settle into my bones. My eyes grew heavy, and I caught myself nodding off more than once. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe the way the headlights bounced off the asphalt, creating strange shadows. But as I rounded a curve in the road, something appeared in the distance, a pair of taillights glowing red, like the eyes of some beast lurking in the dark. My heart leapt in my chest. Another truck? Out here? On this dead stretch of road? I leaned forward, squinting to get a better look. The truck ahead was moving slowly, far too slowly for this kind of road. I eased off the accelerator, giving myself some distance. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The taillights looked strange, faded almost, like they weren't really there. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I pulled alongside the truck. It was an old rig, rusted and beaten up, the kind of truck you'd expect to see in a junkyard, not out here on the open road. The paint was chipped and peeling, and the trailer it was hauling looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades. But that wasn't the strangest part. There was no driver. I blinked, rubbed my eyes and glanced again. No driver. The cab was empty, the seat covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked like no one had been in there for years. And yet the truck kept moving, slowly, steadily, as if guided by some unseen force. A chill ran down my spine. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, desperate to put some distance between myself and that thing. My Kenworth roared to life, speeding down the highway, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truck was still behind me, that it was following me. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time had started to blur together in my exhaustion, fueled haze. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those eerie taillights glowing in the darkness behind me. But there was nothing. The road was empty. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. It must have been my mind playing tricks on me. I was tired, after all, and this road had a way of messing with your head. I tried to convince myself that what I saw wasn't real, but then the CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker 19, Breaker 19, anyone out there?" The voice was gravelly, like the speaker had been smoking a pack a day for decades. I grabbed the receiver, grateful for any kind of distraction. "Yeah, this is Big Red. Who's on the liney?" There was a pause, followed by a long, static, filled breath. "You saw him, didn't you?" My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "The truck," the voice rasped. "The one with no driver. You saw it, didn't you?" I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. "How do you know about that?" The voice on the other end let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "You're not the first. Won't be the last either." Before I could respond, the radio went silent again, leaving only the faint hiss of static. I set the receiver down, my hands shaking. I didn't want to believe what I had just heard, but something deep inside me knew it was true. That truck wasn't just some abandoned rig, it was something else, something that didn't belong on the road, or anywhere else for that matter. The next few hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and paranoia. Every shadow on the road seemed to move, and every flicker of light had me on edge. I just wanted to reach the truck stop, to get off this cursed highway and put as much distance between myself and that ghost truck as possible. Finally, Just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I saw it, the neon sign of a truck stop, glowing like a beacon of salvation. I pulled off the highway, my tires crunching on the gravel lot as I parked the rig. I stumbled out of the cab, my legs weak and trembling from the long haul. Inside, the truck stop was quiet, with only a handful of drivers sitting at the counter, nursing cups of coffee. I grabbed a seat and ordered a coffee of my own, hoping the caffeine would help shake off the lingering unease. As I sat there, staring into my cup, an old timer at the counter turned to me, his weathered face creased with age and experience. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son." I forced a chuckle, but it came out hollow. "You could say that." The old man nodded slowly, as if he understood more than I was letting on. "Let me guess, you were driving Highway 76. My heart skipped a beat. "Yeah, how'd you know?" He leaned back in his seat, lighting a cigarette. "Been driving these roads for over 40 years. I've heard the stories. Hell, I've seen it myself." "The truck?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, blowing out a cloud of smoke. "The phantom trucker, they call it, shows up every now and then, usually on nights like this. No one knows where it came from or why it's out there. Some say it's the ghost of a driver who died on the road, still trying to finish his last haul. Others say it's something darker, something that's been around a lot longer than trucks and highways." I swallowed hard, the coffee in my stomach turning to lead. "What happens if you see it?" The old man shrugged. "Most people just keep driving. They say if you don't look back, it won't follow you. But if you do, well, some folks don't make it to the next stop." I didn't know what to say. The idea that I had come that close to something so unnatural, so otherworldly, made my skin crawl. The old man finished his cigarette and stood up, tossing a few bills on the counter. "Take my advice, kid. Stay off Highway 76, especially at night. There are things out there that don't belong in our world." I nodded numbly as he walked out of the truck stop, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I never drove Highway 76 again after that night. I didn't care if it added hours to my trip or cost me a few extra bucks in gas. It wasn't worth the risk because I knew, deep down, that the phantom trucker was still out there, roaming the loneliest road, looking for someone else to follow, and I wasn't about to be his next target. Years have passed since that night, but the memory of the phantom trucker still haunts me. Sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I think I catch a glimpse of those eerie taillights in the distance, flickering in the dark. And every time I grip the wheel a little tighter, my heart racing in my chest. Because I know that out there, on some forgotten stretch of highway, the phantom trucker is still waiting. And one day, he might find me again. They call Route 81 the Highway of Broken Dreams, though you won't find that name on any map. It's not the road itself that's dangerous, it's the stories that come from it. Stories no one can quite explain. Stories of drivers who went out one night and never returned, or came back too scarred to ever drive again. I'd been a trucker for over a decade, and I'd heard all the tales. Most of us chalked it up to road, weary hallucinations, or the kind of tall tales truckers pass around to keep themselves awake on long hauls. But I wasn't the kind of guy to scare easily. I'd logged thousands of miles across every kind of road you can imagine. I figured I'd seen it all. Until the night Route 81 nearly ended my career and my life. It was a typical haul from Ohio to Tennessee, a shipment of auto parts that needed to be there by morning. I'd been driving for about 8 hours already, and the highway was unusually empty, even for a Sunday night. The GPS had me taking Route 81 for a big stretch of the trip. It was a shortcut through the hills and valleys, winding but faster, than sticking to the interstate. As the last bit of daylight disappeared behind the mountains, I flipped on my high beams, leaned back in the seat, and settled in for what I expected to be an uneventful few hours. The radio played soft country tunes, and the hum of the engine was almost soothing. That's when I noticed the first odd thing. The truck's headlights picked up a small black shape darting across the road up ahead. It was fast, barely more than a blur, but it was enough to get my pulse going. A deer, I thought, or maybe a stray dog. But there was something off about the way it moved. Too fast, too smooth, and it had been so low to the ground. I slowed down, scanning the side of the road. Nothing. Just the endless stretch of asphalt and the dense trees lining the route. Shaking my head, I pushed the thought away. Long hauls at night made your eyes play tricks on you. That's all it was. An hour passed. I hadn't seen another vehicle since I'd turned onto Route 81, not even a pair of distant taillights, just miles and miles of road with no sign of life. The isolation started to creep in, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I'd driven lonely. Roads before, but this one was different. It was too quiet. The kind of silence that pressed in on you made you feel like you were the only living thing for miles. I checked the clock on the dash, 2:15 a.m. If I kept a good pace, I'd make it to the next truck stop by 4. Suddenly, the CB radio crackled to life. I jumped, the unexpected sound cutting through the stillness like a gunshot. I hadn't heard a peep on the CB all night. "Breaker 1-9, anyone out there?" The voice was faint, distant, like it was coming through a tunnel. I grabbed the receiver, grateful for some human contact. "Yeah, this is Long Haul Lou. Who's on the line?" There was a pause, then a burst of static. "You heading down Route 81, Lou?" A cold chill ran down my spine. How did they know? I hadn't mentioned my location. Yeah. Who is this?" Another pause, longer this time. "You need to be careful, Lou. That road's not safe." "There's something out there." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "What are you talking about?" The radio went silent. I waited, holding the receiver in a death grip, but there was nothing but static. I set it down, my hands shaking. I tried to brush it off as some prank, but my nerves were on edge now. I kept checking my mirrors, half, expecting to see something following me, but the road behind was just as empty as the road ahead. Another hour passed, and I'd almost convinced myself that the weird radio message was just some joker messing around when I saw it. Up ahead, barely visible in the faint glow of my headlights, there was something on the road. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, a figure walking along the shoulder, hunched over and moving slow. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't walking, it was crawling. My heart pounded in my chest as I eased off the gas. The figure was human, or at least it looked human, but it moved in this strange, jerky way, like its limbs didn't quite work right. It was dragging itself along the ground, its arms stretched out in front, pulling its body inch by inch. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I didn't want to stop. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, to leave that thing behind and not look back. But what if it was someone in trouble? What if they needed help? Against my better judgment, I slowed down, bringing the truck to a stop a few feet away from the crawling figure. My headlights bathed it in a sickly yellow light, and that's when I saw it up close. It wasn't human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its eyes were too big for its face, wide and bulging, glowing faintly in the dark. And its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, rows of sharp, pointed teeth gleaming in the light. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was like something out of a nightmare, something that shouldn't exist. Then it moved. With a speed that defied its earlier sluggishness, the thing lunged toward the truck, its long arms reaching for the cab. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the truck lurched forward. The creature let out a high-pitched shriek, a sound that rattled through the cab and sent a jolt of terror straight to my core. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My hands were white, knuckled on the wheel as I sped down the highway, the engine roaring as I pushed the truck as fast as it would go. The shriek echoed in my ears even after I was miles down the road. It took me a while to realize I was holding my breath. I exhaled shakily, my heart still hammering in my chest. What the hell was that thing? Some kind of animal? A person with some horrible deformity? But deep down, I knew it wasn't anything natural. Whatever that thing was, it didn't belong in this world. I didn't stop again until I reached the next truck stop. It was a run-down little place, just a few pumps and a diner. But it felt like a sanctuary after what I'd just been through. I parked the rig, climbed out of the cab, and leaned against the hood, trying to steady my breathing. Inside the diner, a few truckers sat at the counter, their faces lit by the dull glow of the overhead lights. I took a seat and ordered a coffee, my hands still trembling. The waitress, an older woman with a kind smile, placed the mug in front of me. "You okay, hon? You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed, but it came out as more of a nervous chuckle. Something like that. The guy sitting next to me, a burly trucker with a grizzled beard, glanced over. "You come down Route 81? I nodded. He let out a low whistle. "You see anything strange?" My mouth went dry. "Yeah, something crawling on the road. It looked like a person, but it wasn't." The trucker exchanged a glance with the waitress, then looked back at me. "You're not the first. There's been stories about that stretch of road for years. Some folks say it's haunted. Others say it's something else, something older." "Older?" I echoed. He shrugged. "Some kind of creature. Lives out there in the hills, only comes out at night. Folks around here call it the night crawler." I swallowed hard, the memory of that thing's twisted smile flashing in my mind. "What does it want?" The trucker shook his head. "Nobody knows. But if you see it, the best thing you can do is keep driving and don't look back." I sat there in stunned silence, my coffee growing cold in front of me. Part of me wanted to believe it was just a tall tale, something the locals told to spook outsiders, but I'd seen it with my own eyes, and I knew that whatever was out there on Route 81, it was real. I finished my coffee, left a tip on the counter, and headed back to the truck. As I climbed into the cab, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the dark lot, but there was nothing there. Just the wind rustling through the trees, but as I pulled out onto the highway, I couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. I never drove Route 81 again, and every time I hit the road at night, I keep my eyes peeled for anything crawling along the shoulder, just in case the night crawler decides to show itself again. It was a little after midnight when I hit the open road. a long stretch of highway with nothing but the sound of my 18-wheeler's engine to keep me company. I'd been hauling freight from Michigan to Texas for the past 4 days, and I was in the final leg of the journey. The night was heavy, the kind of stillness that only comes in the deep hours between dusk and dawn, and the highway was eerily quiet. The moon was obscured by thick clouds, and the darkness felt like it was swallowing the road whole. This wasn't my first time on a night haul, but something about this drive felt off. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. As soon as I merged onto this particular stretch of highway, I told myself it was just exhaustion. I'd been driving for hours and my eyes were heavy. I downed 2 cups of black coffee before leaving the last truck stop, but the jittery energy only seemed to make the silence louder, the emptiness more oppressive. The road ahead was a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Texas plains, with nothing but flat land as far as the eye could see. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 12:15 a.m. My GPS said I had another 4 hours before I could stop for the night, and I was more than ready for it. The freight I was hauling was due by morning, and I figured I'd make good time if I kept moving, but that nagging feeling in the back of my mind kept distracting me. Something wasn't right. Suddenly the radio crackled. I hadn't touched the dial, and there were no other trucks in the area as far as I could tell. The static was faint at first, like a distant whisper, but then it grew louder, more insistent. I frowned and adjusted the volume, trying to clear up the signal, but it was no use. Then, through the white noise, a voice broke through, distorted, but unmistakable. "Breaker 19, any truckers out there?" I froze. My hand hovered over the CB radio, unsure if I should respond. Something about the voice didn't sit right with me. It was flat, emotionless, like the person on the other end wasn't entirely human. "Breaker 19, any truckers?"
"Out there?" The voice came again, louder this time and more insistent. I felt a chill creep down my spine. I'd been a trucker long enough to know that sometimes you hear things on the CB late at night, especially in remote areas.
People mess with each other, playing pranks, trying to spook drivers. But this didn't feel like a prank. There was something sinister in that voice, something that made my skin crawl. Against my better judgment, I picked up the mic. "This is Long Haul Hank," I copy. "Who's on the line?" There was a long pause, the kind that stretches just a little too long, making you wish you hadn't spoken at all. Finally, the voice came back, but it was even more garbled now, almost unintelligible. "Careful. On the road, not alone." The static swallowed the voice before I could respond, and then the radio went dead. I stared at the CB, my heart pounding in my chest. Not alone? What the hell was that supposed to mean? I glanced in my rear-view mirrors, half expecting to see another vehicle behind me, but the road was empty. I was alone. Or at least, I thought,
I was. I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing sense of dread that had taken hold of me. It was just a glitch. The CB radios on these old rigs were notorious for picking up stray signals, especially in remote areas. That's all it was.
I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and pressed the pedal a little harder, eager to put more distance between myself and whatever that voice had been. The road stretched on, dark and desolate, and the only sounds were the rumble of the engine and the rhythmic thud of tires on asphalt. But my nerves were on edge now. Every shadow on the highway seemed to move in the corner of my eye, and every gust of wind sounded like a whisper just outside my window. An hour passed, maybe more, and the tension slowly began to drain from my shoulders. I hadn't heard any more strange transmissions, and the highway remained empty. I started to think maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, just a combination of exhaustion and too much coffee. I flicked on the radio, hoping some Music would keep me awake and leaned back in my seat, trying to relax. That's when I saw it. Up ahead, in the distance, there was a figure standing in the middle of the road. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively eased off the gas, squinting through the windshield. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man, standing motionless in the center of the lane, facing my truck. I hit the horn, a long, blaring blast that should have sent anyone running to the side of the road. But the figure didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me, or at least I thought he was. I couldn't make out his face. My headlights only illuminated the silhouette of his body, tall and thin with long arms that hung unnaturally at his sides. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt as the truck skidded to a stop just a few feet from the figure. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and for a moment I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the man in front of me. He was still standing there, motionless, his face obscured by shadow. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. I didn't want to get out, but what if he needed help? Maybe he was in some kind of trouble. But then, why hadn't he
Moved? Why hadn't he gotten out of the way when he saw my truck barreling down on him? I swallowed hard, my mouth dry.
Slowly, I reached for the flashlight I kept in the glove compartment and opened the door. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, and I shivered as I stepped out of the cab, my boots crunching against the gravel on the side of the road. I shined the flashlight toward the figure, but as the beam of light hit the spot where he should have been standing, my blood ran cold. He was gone. I blinked, my heart racing. There was no one there. I swept the flashlight back and forth, across the road, but it was empty. The man, if that's what he'd been, had vanished. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was I so tired that my mind had conjured up a phantom in the middle of the road? I backed up, slowly, keeping the flashlight trained on the spot where the figure had been, half expecting him to reappear. But the road remained empty. I climbed back into the truck, my hands shaking as I slammed the door shut and locked it. I didn't bother turning the radio back on. I didn't want to hear anything. I just wanted to get the hell off that road as fast as I could. I gunned the engine and sped down the highway, my eyes darting from the road ahead to the mirrors, half expecting to see the figure standing behind me in the middle of the road, but the rest of the drive was uneventful. No more voices on the CB, no more figures in the road. By the time the sun rose and I reached my destination, I'd almost convinced myself it had all been a hallucination, a result of too little sleep and too much caffeine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there that night, something that had watched me, something that had wanted me to stop. I delivered the freight, signed the paperwork, and got back in my truck. I had another haul to make, but I took a detour, avoiding Route 81 altogether. I wasn't going to take any chances. That night, when I finally stopped at a truck stop to rest, I sat at the counter nursing a cup of coffee. An older trucker, grey, bearded and weathered, sat down next to me. We made small talk for a while, sharing the usual stories of long hauls
And bad weather. But when I mentioned Route 81, his expression darkened.
"You seen him, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low. I frowned. "Seen who?" "The rider," he said. "The man in the road. He appears to some drivers, makes them stop. But not everyone who stops gets to keep driving." I stared at him, the memory of the figure in the road flashing in my mind. "What do you mean?" He leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. They say he's a ghost. Some poor soul who died out on that highway, hit by a truck, just like yours.
Now he haunts the road trying to stop drivers, trying to get someone to take him with them, but once he's in your truck, you're never seen again. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I knew he was it.
Right. I'd seen the rider, and I'd been lucky. I finished my coffee, left a tip on the counter, and walked back to my truck. As I climbed into the cab, The road was long and lonely, stretching out beneath the weight of the dark Texas sky as I rumbled along in my truck. I was Eric Red Sullivan, a long-haul truck driver with over a decade on the road. I had seen it all: wild weather, the desolation of the open highways, and more strange encounters than I could count. But nothing could prepare me for what was about to happen on this fateful night. It had been a long week, and I was due for some rest. I had just picked up a last, minute delivery at a small warehouse outside of Amarillo and was heading to a drop off point in New Mexico. The load was light, just a few crates filled with who knows what, but it had to be there by dawn. The promise of another paycheck was enough to keep me going. As I settled into my seat, the familiar hum of the engine was almost soothing. I pulled out onto the highway, the headlights slicing through the thick darkness, illuminating the asphalt ahead. The rhythmic thrum of the tires against the road was like a heartbeat, steady and comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the time of night, or the way the clouds hung low in the sky, blotting out the moon and stars. Or maybe it was the fact that I was the only one on the road, no other trucks, no cars, just me and the endless stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. As the hours slipped by, I tried to keep my mind occupied with the radio, but the static crackled ominously, punctuating the silence. I flipped through channels, hoping to find something to break the monotony. That's when I heard it, a faint voice on the CB radio. "Breaker 19, you got any truckers out there? Need to talk about the dark roads." I frowned, unsure if I should respond. It was late, and the tone of the voice sent a shiver down my spine. "This is Red. Who's out there?" I finally said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Red, you..."
"There? Listen closely," the voice crackled back. "You gotta be careful out there. The shadows have teeth."
I scoffed, half expecting it to be some sort of prank. "Shadows don't have teeth, buddy. You sure you're not just tired? Just keep your eyes open, don't stop for anyone," the voice urged, then faded into static. A cold chill crept up my spine, but I shrugged it off, shaking my head. I'd heard plenty of tall tales in my time, but this felt different. I adjusted the volume on the radio, hoping to drown out the lingering unease, but the next few miles felt like a countdown, each one dragging me closer to an unknown destination. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a figure appeared on the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as I skidded to a halt just inches from the edge. My heart raced as I squinted into the darkness. It was a woman, standing there, shrouded in shadows. She looked disheveled, hair wild and clothes torn, as if she had just come from some kind of struggle. "Help me!" she shouted, her voice trembling with desperation. "Please!" I hesitated, the earlier warning echoing in my mind. But as she stepped closer, the moonlight finally illuminated her face. Her eyes were wide with fear, glistening with unshed tears, and I could see the desperation etched into her features.
"Get in!" I shouted, throwing open the passenger door. She jumped in, slamming the door behind her as if the darkness was chasing her. Drive, just drive, she cried, and I didn't need to be told twice. I shifted back into gear and
took off, the engine roaring to life as I pulled away from the side of the road. "Did you see him?" she asked, breathless. "See who?" I asked, glancing over at her. She was trembling, her eyes darting around the cab, as if she expected someone to appear at any moment. "The man, the one who was following me, he's
out there," she gasped. I frowned, trying to keep my focus on the road. "What do you mean? Did he attack you?" "Yes," she exclaimed, her voice rising in panic.
He came out of nowhere. I was hitchhiking, trying to get to my friend's house, and he grabbed me." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I didn't want to pry, but curiosity pushed me to ask. "What did he look like? Her eyes went wide again, and she shook her head vigorously. "I don't know. It was dark, and he wore a hood. I could only see his eyes, and they were wrong, empty, like he wasn't human." A chill washed over me, the hairs on my neck standing on end. I stole another glance at her, and the reality of the situation started to sink in. I was driving a massive truck down an isolated highway with a woman who had just escaped something terrifying. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. "Laura," she replied, her voice shaking. "I don't know what's happening, but we need to get away from here." I nodded, trying to keep my eyes on the road ahead. I was still reeling from the encounter, but I couldn't let it show. Instead, I focused on the headlights illuminating the dark stretch of asphalt, each mile marker slipping by as I raced towards safety. "Where are you headed?" I asked, hoping to distract her from her panic. "Just anywhere but here," she said, her voice breaking. "I just want to get away from him." I could feel the weight of her fear pressing down on me, a palpable tension that hung thick in the air. I wanted to reassure her, to say everything would be fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As the miles dragged on, I glanced at the rearview mirror. The darkness swallowed the road behind us, but something felt off. I thought I saw movement, a shadow flickering in and out of sight. My heart raced as I tightened my grip on the wheel. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What?" Laura turned to look behind us, her expression shifting to fear. "There's something back there," I said, my pulse quickening. I think someone's following
us." Her eyes widened, and I could see the panic rise again. "Go faster! We have to get away!" I pressed down on the accelerator, the truck roaring to life as we sped down the empty highway. The shadows loomed around us, wrapping the
truck in darkness. I glanced at the speedometer, 80 miles an hour, and we were still losing daylight. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed against the cab, and I nearly swerved off the road. "What was that?" I yelled. "I don't know," Laura screamed, her voice breaking. "Just keep going." The tension was suffocating, a thick fog that seemed to settle in the truck. My heart raced as I tried to focus on the road ahead. I couldn't let fear control me, but then I heard it again, a scratching sound like nails dragging against metal coming from the back of the truck. "What is that?" Laura shrieked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I shouted, trying to keep my eyes on the road. The noise grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the cab like a haunting whisper. "Stay calm, I'm sure it's just the load shifting." But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The sound was too frantic, too alive, as if something was clawing its way inside. I felt a surge of panic rising within me, and I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Time was slipping away, and I had to get us off this highway before whatever was out there caught up. "Just keep going, don't stop," Laura urged, her hands gripping the seat as if it would save her from whatever terror was outside. I pressed down harder on the accelerator, pushing the truck to its limits. The landscape blurred past us, but the scratching continued, relentless and maddening. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as fear wrapped its icy fingers around my throat. Suddenly I spotted a dim light up ahead, a gas station, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of dread. "I think we should stop," I said, glancing over at Laura. "We need to check out the truck." "No!" she cried, her eyes wide with terror. "We can't. He'll
find us. Laura, we can't just keep driving like this. I need to see what's happening. I need to see..."
I slowed down as we approached the gas station, and the truck shuddered to a halt. The scratching grew louder, a frantic sound echoing through the metal body. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "We can't stay in here," I said, glancing at the shadows that loomed outside. "We have to check the back of the truck." "No, please don't make me," she begged, her voice trembling. I reached for the door handle, determination coursing through me.
"I have to. I'll be right back. Just stay here and keep the doors locked." I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap.
I felt exposed, vulnerable, as I made my way around to the back of the truck. The gas station's light cast eerie shadows across the pavement, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The scratching grew louder, and I hesitated for a moment before gripping the latch and swinging the doors open. The sight inside made my stomach drop. The crates were toppled, some spilling their contents onto the floor. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. Lurking in the shadows, a figure crouched low, half hidden behind the crates. It was the man Laura had described, the one with the hood. My breath caught in my throat as I realized his eyes were, indeed, empty, devoid of any humanity. He stared at me with an intensity that made me feel like prey in his gaze. "Get back in the truck," I shouted, my voice echoing in the stillness. But as I turned to run, the figure lunged at me, its
movements impossibly quick. I barely had time to react as it slammed into me, knocking me to the ground. Pain shot through my body as I hit the asphalt, my vision spinning. I fought to push myself up, but the man was upon me, a hand closing around my throat. I struggled against his grip, gasping for breath as he leaned in closer, his breath foul and rancid. "You shouldn't have picked her up," he hissed, his voice low and sinister. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to throw him off me, scrambling to my feet. "Laura!" I screamed, looking back toward the truck. She was still inside, eyes wide with terror as she watched the scene unfold. I
could hear her voice calling out, pleading for help. I turned back to the figure, my heart racing. There was no way I was letting him take her. I charged at him, adrenaline fueling my strength as I swung a fist at his face, but he dodged effortlessly, his movements fluid and unnatural. He laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine.
"You think you can protect her?" he taunted, his eyes narrowing as he lunged at me again. I dodged just in time, barely escaping his grasp as I stumbled backward, trying to find my footing.
The truck loomed behind me, a sanctuary in the darkness, but I couldn't let him get to Laura. "Get out! Get out now!" I yelled at her. The figure lunged again, this time catching me by the collar of my shirt and dragging me toward the shadows. I kicked and struggled, but he was impossibly strong. Just as I thought I was done for, Laura burst from the truck, a wild look in her eyes.
"Get away from him!" she screamed, brandishing a wrench she must have grabbed from the cab. With a swing, she struck the man across the face, and he stumbled back, momentarily stunned. "Now!" I shouted, and we both dashed back towards
the truck, adrenaline coursing through our veins. The man recovered quickly, his eyes flashing with fury as he lunged after us. We jumped inside, slamming the doors shut. I locked them, my heart pounding in my chest as I scrambled for the keys. Laura was shaking beside me, her eyes wide with fear. "Drive! Drive!" she shouted, her voice a frantic pitch. I turned the key in the ignition, praying the truck would start. It roared to life, and I slammed it into gear, flooring the accelerator. The tires screeched against the pavement as we tore away from the gas station, the figure receding into the darkness behind us. We drove for what felt like an eternity, the only sound the roar of the engine and the pounding of our hearts. But as we sped down the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being hunted. "Do you think he's gone?" Laura asked, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. "I don't know," I admitted, my pulse racing. "We just need to keep going. Get to the next town, find a police station or something." The landscape blurred past us, but the oppressive weight of fear lingered in the air. I could feel Laura's gaze on me, a mixture of fear and desperation.
"Why would he come after me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "Maybe you saw something you weren't supposed to." "I was just trying to get home," she cried. "I didn't do anything wrong." "Listen, we're going to get you home, I promise," I said, trying to reassure her as much as myself. We drove for another hour, the headlights cutting through the darkness as we searched for signs of civilization.
But as the minutes stretched on, the fear clawing at my insides grew unbearable. "Look!" Laura suddenly shouted, pointing to a distant light flickering on the horizon. "A diner! We can stop there!" I nodded, feeling a flicker of hope as we approached the glowing sign. It was an old-fashioned diner, neon lights buzzing softly, but it felt like a beacon of safety in the desolate night. I pulled into the parking lot and we both stepped out of the truck, the night air cool against our skin. As we approached the diner, a sense of dread settled over me again. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't out of danger yet. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, the only customers a couple of truckers nursing their cups of coffee. The waitress, a kind-looking woman with tired eyes, greeted us as we walked in. "Welcome, folks. You hungry?" "Just coffee, please," I said, glancing around nervously. "And maybe some pie." Laura nodded, her expression still tight with fear. We slid into a booth, and I could feel the tension in the air as we sat in silence, the weight of our ordeal hanging between us. The waitress returned with our drinks, and I took a long sip, trying to calm my nerves. "You two look like you've been through hell," she said, concern etched on her face. I hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "Just a rough night on the road," I said finally. "Where are you headed?" she asked, glancing out the window. "New Mexico," I replied, but my eyes darted toward the entrance. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if the shadows outside were lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. The waitress nodded, her gaze flicking back to us. "Well, you're lucky to be here. You don't want to be caught."
"Out there after dark, not anymore." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward.
She hesitated, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. "There are stories, things that happen on those roads. People go missing, and not just the truckers." Laura shivered, and I felt my heart race. "Like what?"
"There's a man, they say he's a ghost. Comes for those who wander too far from the road, drags them into the dark. You should have seen the news last week. Another girl disappeared from the highway."
My stomach dropped. Laura's face was pale as she turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "Is that what happened to me?" The waitress nodded gravely. "Could be. You're lucky you got away, but I wouldn't stay here long. If he's out there, he might still be looking for you." I felt a wave of dread wash over me. We couldn't stay here. Thank you for the coffee, I said abruptly, throwing some cash on the table. We have to go. The waitress's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to say something, but I turned and grabbed Laura's arm, leading her back outside. The cool night air hit us, and I glanced around, scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. Are you okay? I asked, my voice low. I don't know, she said, trembling slightly. What if he's out there? We'll be fine, I assured her, but I felt a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. We jumped back into the truck, and I started the engine, heart pounding as I prepared to leave the diner behind. But just as I was about to pull out of the parking lot, a figure emerged from the shadows near the entrance. It was him. The man from the highway stood there, eyes glowing like embers in the dark. I felt my breath catch in my throat as he stepped closer, his expression twisted into a cruel smile.
Going somewhere, he taunted, voice low and menacing. I slammed the truck into reverse, my heart racing as I tried to put distance between us. But he was faster than I anticipated. Lunging toward the vehicle, I felt a jolt of terror as
I hit the gas, pulling away from the diner, but not before I saw the look in his eyes. Hunger, rage, and something deeper, something primal. Drive, just go, Laura screamed, her voice snapping me back to reality. I took off down the highway, the lights of the diner fading into the distance. The road stretched ahead, but the shadows felt closer than ever. My heart raced as I fought against the fear gnawing at my insides. What do we do? Laura asked, her voice shaking. We just need to keep driving, I said, my mind racing. We'll find a safe place, a town, anything. But as the miles flew by, the shadows began to shift around us, dark shapes flickering just out of reach. I could feel him out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every sound made me jump, and Laura's quiet whimpers filled the air, a reminder of the terror we were both feeling. Where are we? She whispered, glancing out the window at the passing landscape. I don't know, I admitted, but we can't stop. Not yet. The headlights illuminated the dark road ahead, but the oppressive darkness surrounding us felt suffocating. The engine roared as I pressed the accelerator, desperate to put more distance between us and the figure from the diner. But the feeling
of dread only grew, the shadows stretching and twisting as I drove. I could feel my grip tightening on the steering wheel, knuckles white with fear.
Do you think he's still following us? Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, I said, shaking my head. But we can't let our guard down. We drove for what felt like hours, the endless road stretching before us. But in the distance, I finally spotted something, a flicker of light on the horizon. My heart leapt as I realized it was a small town, the warm glow of streetlights breaking the oppressive darkness. There! I shouted, pointing. A town! Thank
God! Laura breathed, her voice filled with relief. I pulled into the town, the streets lined with old buildings and the reassuring presence of life.
We passed a few people walking along the sidewalk, and I felt a flicker of hope. We were safe. I parked in front of a small motel, the neon sign buzzing softly. Let's get a room, I said, glancing at Laura. Are you sure it's safe? She asked, her eyes darting around. I don't know, but we need to stop and regroup, I replied, just for a little while. We hurried inside and I approached the front desk. An older man looked up, surprise etched on his face. Evening, folks. What can I do for you? Room for the night, please, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Sure thing, he said, quickly processing my request. It'll be $50. I pulled out my wallet, handing him cash as my heart raced. I could feel Laura's anxiety beside me, and I turned to her, trying to reassure her.
It's going to be okay. Here's your key, the man said, handing it over. Room 3, just down the hall. I took the key, nodding in thanks before leading Laura down the dimly lit hallway. Each step felt heavy, as if the weight of the night was pressing down on us. When we reached the door, I unlocked it and pushed it open, the musty air greeting us. It was a small room with 2 beds, a flickering lamp, and a tiny bathroom in the corner. I locked the door behind us,
breathing a sigh of relief. "We're safe," I said, trying to convince both of us. Laura flopped down on the bed, her shoulders slumping in exhaustion. "I can't believe this is happening," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. I sat beside her, feeling the weight of the night settle around us. "We're going to be okay," I assured her. "We'll figure this out in the morning." But as I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The shadows felt alive, creeping in on us, suffocating in their presence. "Do you think he knows where we are?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, glancing at the window. The streetlights outside flickered, casting strange shadows in the room. "But we can't let our guard down. We need to stay vigilant." As the night dragged on, I found it hard to sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of the figure, the dark presence lurking outside. I could hear Laura's soft breaths beside me, a reminder that she was still here, still with me. Hours passed, and I finally drifted off, but it felt like I barely closed my eyes before a loud bang jolted me awake. My heart raced as I shot up, scanning the room. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Laura, but she was still fast asleep. I listened intently, straining to hear any sound. The room felt cold, the air thick with tension. Then I heard it again, a soft scratching sound coming from the window. Fear gripped me as I got up, inching toward the window. I peered through the curtain, but there was nothing there, just the empty street bathed in the glow of the streetlights. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the fear crawling up my spine. It was just my imagination, I told myself. But as I lay back down, the scratching continued, a relentless reminder that we were not safe. I turned to Laura, her face peaceful in sleep, and felt a surge of protectiveness. I couldn't let anything happen to her. I wouldn't allow it. The night wore on, and I lay there, wide awake, every creak of the building sending my heart into overdrive. Just when I thought I might finally drift off, there was another bang, louder this time. I shot up, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I turned to Laura. "Wake up!" I hissed, shaking her gently. "We need to go now!" "What? Why?" she mumbled, blinking in confusion. "I heard something. We can't stay here," I said, my voice urgent. She sat up, panic creeping into her eyes. "What do you mean?" "There's something out there," I said, glancing at the window again. "I don't know what it is, but I can't shake this feeling that we're not alone." Laura nodded, her face pale as she scrambled to get dressed. I threw on my clothes, my heart racing as I glanced at the door. We had to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. Once we were both dressed, I checked the time. It was just past 2 a.m. The town was shrouded in darkness, the only sound the wind rustling outside. "Let's get out of here," I said, heading to the door. "Wait!" Laura said, grabbing my arm. "What if he's out there?" "We'll take our chances," I replied, opening the door just a crack. I peered into the hallway, the shadows clinging to the corners. It felt empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I opened the door wider and stepped out, glancing back at Laura, who followed closely behind. We moved quietly down the hallway, each step echoing in the silence. I led the way to the exit, my heart pounding with every sound. When we reached the front door, I glanced back one last time, fear gnawing at my insides. Outside, the night was still, but the feeling of dread was palpable. The shadows loomed large, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "We need to get to the truck," I said, glancing around. We hurried across the parking lot, but just as we reached the truck, a loud crash echoed through the night. My heart dropped as I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the distance, the figure stood, illuminated by the flickering streetlight. He grinned, a twisted smile that sent shivers down my spine. "You can't run from me," he taunted, his voice echoing in the stillness. I felt Laura freeze beside me, fear radiating off her. "What do we do?" she whispered, panic lacing her words.
"Get in the truck!" I shouted, scrambling for the door. We jumped inside and I slammed the door shut, locking it as quickly as I could. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking as I tried to start the engine. "Go! Go!" Laura screamed, her eyes wide with terror. I turned the key, but the engine sputtered, refusing to start. "Come on!" I shouted, frustration boiling over as I tried again. The figure was getting closer, moving with an unnatural speed, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. I felt a wave of panic wash over me as I tried once more, praying it would work. Finally, the engine roared to life and I slammed it into gear, my foot pressing down on the accelerator. The truck surged forward, but the figure lunged, barely missing my side mirror. "Drive!" Laura yelled, clutching the dashboard. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, tires screeching as we tore away. From the motel, the figure disappearing into the shadows behind us. We sped down the highway, the night air rushing past us, but I could still feel the weight of his presence lurking in the darkness. "Where do we go now?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. "We just need to keep moving," I replied, trying, to sound confident. But the fear was palpable, crawling under my skin as we drove into the night. The headlights cut through the dark, but every shadow felt like a threat. Every sound made my heart race. After what felt like hours of driving, we finally spotted the lights of another small town in the distance. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the parking lot of a diner, heart racing. "Let's go inside," I said, glancing at Laura. We climbed out of the truck, the cool air hitting us as we hurried inside. The diner was small but welcoming, the smell of coffee and breakfast filling the air. The waitress smiled at us, concern flickering in her eyes. "You two okay?" "We just need a place to sit," I said, my voice shaky. She nodded and led us to a booth, handing us menus. I glanced around, still feeling the weight of what had just happened. "Do you think he followed us?" Laura asked, her hands trembling, as she clutched the menu. "I don't know," I said, trying to stay calm. "But we'll be okay here. We can figure out what to do next." We ordered coffee, my hands shaking as I held the cup. The warmth was comforting, but my mind raced with thoughts of the figure. "Why did he target us?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, looking into her eyes. "But we're going to get through this together, I promise." Just then, the door to the diner swung open, and my heart dropped. There he was, the figure from the motel, standing in the doorway, grinning that twisted smile. I froze, and the waitress's eyes widened in shock. "Oh my God!" she whispered, backing away. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Laura's hand as we bolted for the door. But the figure was already moving, his eyes locked on us. We dashed. Outside, adrenaline fueling our every move as we sprinted back to the truck. "Get in!" I yelled, fumbling with the keys as I glanced back. He was gaining on us, but I finally got the door open and we jumped inside, slamming the door shut. I turned the key, praying the engine would start. It roared to life, and I slammed it into gear, tires screeching as we sped away from the diner, the figure fading into the darkness behind us. Where do we go? Laura gasped, tears streaming down her face. I don't know, I said, my heart racing. Just keep your head down. As we drove into the night, the fear was still there, clawing at my insides. But I knew we had
to keep moving, to find a way to escape the nightmare that was chasing us. Little did we know, the real horror was just beginning, The faint glow of dawn struggled to break through the dense forest canopy as I drove my delivery truck along the winding dirt road. I was a long-haul trucker, making my way from one small town to another, delivering packages to rural businesses. That depended on our service. This morning felt different, though. There was an uneasy stillness in the air, and the feeling of being watched sent chills down my spine. I could hear the tires crunching against the gravel, the sound echoing in the otherwise quiet landscape. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling as paranoia. After all, I had been driving for years, and I knew the job came with its own set of eerie experiences, especially at night. But this morning, with the mist swirling around the trees and the rising sun barely lighting the path ahead, my instincts were on high alert. Pulling into the small roadside diner, I hoped to grab some coffee and breakfast to fuel me for the long journey ahead. The Welcome to Molly's Diner sign creaked as I stepped out, the wooden structure looking like it had been there for decades. The scent of bacon wafted through the air as I pushed open the door, the bell above jingling cheerfully. Inside, the diner was filled with the warm glow of yellowed light. A few patrons occupied booths, their conversations hushed as if they were sharing secrets. I took a seat at the counter, and the waitress, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile and hair tied back in a messy bun, approached me. "What can I get for you, hun?" she asked, her voice warm and inviting. "Just a coffee and whatever's good," I replied, trying to shake off the lingering unease. "Coming right up," she said, before bustling off to the kitchen. As I waited for my order, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced around the diner, noticing that the conversations had quieted. The patrons were now looking toward the window, their expressions a mix of curiosity and fear. I turned to see what they were staring at, my heart pounding. Outside, a figure stood at the edge of the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. It was tall and lanky, its silhouette distorted by the morning light. The figure seemed to be watching the diner, its head cocked slightly, almost as if it were studying the people inside. "Who is that?" I asked the waitress as she returned with my coffee. She followed my gaze, and her expression shifted to one of concern. "That's Old Man Wilson. He's been wandering the woods ever since his son went missing a few years back." "What happened to his son?" I asked, intrigued despite myself.
They say he was taken by a creature, she whispered, lowering her voice as if afraid to say it too loudly. "A dog man, they say. It's a local legend, but Old Man Wilson believes it with all his heart. He says the creature is still out
there, watching and waiting. I felt a chill creep down my spine as I sipped my coffee. The bitter taste did little to warm me, and the unease I had felt earlier returned with a vengeance. I glanced back outside, but the figure was gone. "Is he dangerous?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. She shook her head. "No, not him. But they say the dog man is. You'd do best to stay clear of the woods after dark. Strange things
happen out there." I nodded, trying to mask the growing anxiety in my chest.
I paid my bill, thanked the waitress, and stepped back outside, the cool morning air hitting my face. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that clung to me. As I climbed back into my truck, I couldn't help but glance back toward the tree line, half expecting to see Old Man Wilson standing there again. But the woods were quiet, the trees standing like silent sentinels. I started the engine, the rumble drowning out the silence. The truck rolled back onto the dirt road, and I quickly fell into a rhythm, focusing on the task ahead. But the fear lingered, a gnawing doubt that I couldn't shake off. A few hours into my drive, the sun was fully up, casting long shadows along the road. I was passing through a stretch of forest when I heard it, a low, guttural growl resonating from somewhere nearby. My heart raced, and I strained to listen, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. Just the woods, I told myself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But I couldn't help glancing in the side mirror, half expecting to see something following me. Suddenly I spotted movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned to see a large, dark figure darting between the trees. My breath caught in my throat, and I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. I stared into the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. There it was again, a glimpse of fur, a flash of eyes reflecting the sunlight. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of my mind, but fear surged through me, and I fumbled for my phone, considering whether I should call someone. Before I could think clearly, the figure reappeared, this time much closer. It was enormous, standing on all fours with a canine-like head and a muscular body covered in dark fur. My mind raced with the stories I had heard, the local legends of the dogman. I slammed the truck into reverse, my instincts screaming at me to get away. The creature was moving toward the road, its eyes locked on me with an unsettling intelligence. I could feel the weight of its gaze, as if it were sizing me up, deciding whether I was a threat or prey. I hit the gas, my truck lurching backward before I spun the wheel, turning to speed away. The forest blurred past me, the trees becoming a dark wall as I drove faster and faster, the growling echoing in my mind. Suddenly, I heard a loud thump against the side of my truck, causing me to swerve. My heart raced as I glanced out the window, but there was nothing there. I could feel a cold sweat breaking out across my skin as I fought to regain control. I drove like a madman, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, pushing me to put as much distance between myself and the creature as possible. My mind raced with fear and confusion. Was it real? Did I really see that? I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station, the place barely more than a shack with a few pumps outside. I jumped out of my truck, my legs shaking, and rushed inside, the bell jingling as I entered. The clerk looked up from behind the counter, eyes widening at my disheveled state. "You all right, buddy?" I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "I think I saw something out there. In the woods." "Yeah? You mean the dogman?" he asked, a smirk creeping across his face. "Old Man Wilson says he's been out there for years. People have been disappearing, you know." "Is it real?" I pressed, my voice tinged with urgency. He shrugged. "Could be, or just stories to keep people out of the woods. But if I were you, I wouldn't go back out there after dark." I nodded, the clerk's casual demeanor doing little to ease my nerves. I filled my truck with gas, keeping a wary eye on the tree line, expecting to see the creature lurking just beyond the shadows. Once I was back on the road, I couldn't shake the fear that clung to me. The shadows in the forest felt alive, closing in with every mile. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, the light fading and giving way to dusk. Panic clawed at me as I drove, the winding road stretching ahead like a dark tunnel. I had about 2 hours until my next stop, but as I drove deeper into the woods, the unease grew. I was exhausted, the adrenaline from the encounter leaving me drained, but I knew I couldn't stop now. Just as I rounded a bend, my headlights caught something up ahead. My stomach dropped as I recognized the figure. Old Man Wilson stood in the middle of the road, his eyes wide and unfocused. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as I skidded to a stop just inches from him. "What are you doing?" I yelled, my heart racing. He didn't respond, just stood there, staring
At me, as if he didn't even see my truck. I leaned out of the window, trying to get his attention. "Get out of the road! Get out!"
Suddenly he raised his hand, pointing toward the woods. "It's coming! You need to leave! It's coming for you!" Panic surged through me as I felt a chill in the air. I glanced toward the trees, my heart pounding as I saw movement among the shadows. "Get in!" I shouted, throwing open the passenger door. "You need to get in!" He hesitated for a moment before stumbling toward my truck, his face pale and drawn. I could see the fear in his eyes, the wild look that told me he believed every word he was saying. He climbed in, slamming the door behind him. "Drive, now!" he yelled, his voice cracking with urgency. I didn't need to be told twice. I hit the gas, the truck roaring to life as I sped down the road, my heart racing. "What's out there?" I demanded, glancing at him. "The dog, man," he panted, gripping the seat tightly. "It's been hunting me for years. I thought I could keep it away, but it's too strong." "What do you mean?" I pressed, trying to keep my eyes on the road. He shook his head, looking pale and shaken. "It's not just a creature, it's a spirit, a curse. It feeds on fear and darkness. You can't run from it. You have to confront it."
"I don't want to confront anything!" I yelled, my voice rising in panic. "I just want to survive!" His eyes widened as he pointed back toward the trees. "It's right behind us!" I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart dropping.
As I saw a dark shape darting through the woods, moving with impossible speed.
"Faster!" he urged, panic lacing his voice. "We need to get out of here!" I pressed down harder on the gas pedal, the truck speeding forward as I fought to keep my focus on the road. But the feeling of being watched intensified, a cold
weight pressing down on my chest. Just then the headlights caught a flash of movement, and I saw it, a massive, hulking figure, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. The dogman stood at the edge of the road, watching us with an intelligence that sent chills racing through my body. "Don't look at it!" Old Man Wilson shouted, his voice rising in desperation. I forced my gaze back to the road, my heart
pounding in my ears. "What do we do?" I screamed, my panic spiraling. "Drive! Just keep driving. We need to find a place to hide." I could feel the weight of its gaze upon us, the creature moving with unnatural speed, keeping pace with the truck as if it were toying with us. The growling echoed in my ears, a low, menacing sound that rattled my bones. Suddenly the road began to narrow, and I spotted a turnoff leading deeper into the woods. "There!" I shouted, veering off the main road and onto the dirt path. Old Man Wilson looked at me, fear etched on his face. "What are you doing? It's not safe here." "I don't care. We have to hide," I yelled, pushing the truck deeper into the trees. The shadows closed around us as I found a small clearing and slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop. I turned off the engine, my breath coming in rapid gasps. "We can't stay here," he urged, glancing nervously at the trees. "It will find us." I could feel the terror radiating from him, and I fought to calm myself, trying to think clearly. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice shaky. "We have to confront it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's the only way." I shook my head, fear gripping me. "I can't face that thing. I just want to survive." He turned to me, his eyes filled with a wild determination. "You have to. It feeds on fear. If you show it, you're not
afraid. It will lose its power over you." I wanted to argue, but I could see the truth in his eyes. Deep down, I knew I couldn't keep running. I had to stand my ground. "All right," I said, my voice steadying. "What do we do?" "We wait," he replied, gripping the edge of his seat. "And when it comes, we stand together." The darkness around us felt alive, the weight of the woods pressing in. I could hear the distant sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of the wind. My heart raced as I waited, the tension thick in the air. Minutes felt like hours as we sat in silence, the shadows growing darker around us. I could feel the presence of the dogman lurking just beyond the trees, its eyes watching, waiting for the moment to strike. And then I heard it, the low growl echoing through the clearing, sending shivers down my spine. I exchanged a glance with Old Man Wilson, the fear palpable between us. "Remember, don't show fear," he whispered, his voice steady. As the growl grew louder, I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature emerged from the trees, a massive shadow with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "Stay calm, Old Man Wilson,"
urged, his voice a soft whisper. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus on the creature as it stepped closer, its growl vibrating through the air. I could feel the fear creeping up my spine, but I fought against it, forcing myself to
stand firm. The dogman stood before us, its form enormous and imposing, muscles rippling under its dark fur. It stared at us with an intelligence that sent a chill down my spine. I felt a surge of defiance rising within me. "I'm not afraid of you," I shouted, my voice steady. The creature paused, tilting its head, as if considering my words. "We're not afraid," Old Man Wilson shouted beside me, his voice breaking through the tension. The dogman let out a deafening roar, a sound that rattled the windows of the truck, but I held my ground, refusing to back down. The creature stepped closer, its eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I felt a connection, a strange understanding. That transcended fear. It was a creature of darkness, a guardian of the woods, but it thrived on fear. As I stared into its eyes, I felt the weight of the world lift from my shoulders. I was no longer afraid. I was ready to confront whatever it was that had haunted these woods. The growl faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The dogman stood before us, no longer a creature of nightmares, but a force of nature, a being that existed outside of our understanding. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and retreated back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. Old Man Wilson and I sat in silence, our breath coming in heavy gasps. "Did it work?" I asked, my voice trembling. He nodded, a look of relief washing over his face. "You faced it. You showed it your strength." As the sun began to rise, casting golden light through the trees, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The forest no longer felt threatening. We made our way back to the road, the weight of the encounter lingering in our minds. I knew the experience would stay with me forever, a reminder of the power of fear and the strength that lies within. As I drove away from the forest, the sun shining brightly ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had faced something extraordinary. I glanced at Old Man Wilson, who was staring out the window, lost in thought. "Thank you," I said quietly, breaking the silence. He looked at me, a small smile creeping onto his face. "You did well, kid. You faced your fear, and that's more than most can do." As I drove on, I felt a newfound sense of determination coursing through me. I was no longer just a trucker making deliveries. I was a survivor, someone who had faced the darkness and emerged stronger on the other side. The road stretched out before me, and I knew that whatever lay ahead, I could handle it. The dogman might still roam the woods, but I was no longer afraid of the shadows that lurked in the night. The scent of damp wood and musty air greeted me as I stepped onto the grounds of Hollow Creek Manor. It was a sprawling Victorian-style mansion, nestled deep within the woods, isolated from the rest of the world. I had taken up a temporary position as a caretaker for the house while its owners were away on a long vacation. The arrangement seemed simple enough: maintain the place, ensure nothing fell apart, and keep an eye on the property until they returned. In 3 months. They had offered me a generous sum, enough to make it hard to refuse, despite the manor's grim reputation. As I stood there, suitcase in hand, I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me. The overgrown lawn and weathered stone steps leading up to the front door seemed out of place for such a grand estate. The air was unnervingly still, as if the forest around it was holding its breath. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and walked up the steps, the wood creaking underfoot. The front door groaned as I pushed it open. The inside was just as I had imagined, grand, but in a state of disrepair. Dust coated every surface, and the air had that stale, forgotten scent that old buildings often have. The foyer was dominated by a massive chandelier, its crystals dulled by age. To my right was a sweeping staircase, its wooden banister intricately carved, though faded. Large portraits hung on the walls, depicting stern-faced figures who seemed to watch my every move. After exploring the ground floor, I found the room I would be staying in at the far end of the hallway upstairs. It was modest, with a 4-poster bed draped in heavy, moth-eaten curtains. A small window overlooked the front yard, and though it was afternoon, the light barely filtered in through the grimy glass, casting long shadows on the floor. I unpacked my things, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had clung to me since I arrived. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was something about Hollow Creek Manor that felt off, as if the very walls were whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. That first night was eerily quiet. The only sound was the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional creak of the old house settling. I lay in bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling, struggling to sleep. Just as I began to drift off, a faint noise caught my attention. It was subtle at first, barely audible, but it grew louder: footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway just outside my door. I sat up in bed, my skin crawling. It couldn't be the owners, they were miles away, and I was the only one supposed to be here. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Perhaps it was an animal, or the wind playing tricks on my senses. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, frozen in place, staring at the door handle. My pulse quickened as I waited for something, anything, to happen. But the door remained closed, and after what felt like an eternity, the sound of footsteps resumed, this time heading back down the hallway, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I convinced myself it had all been my imagination. The house was old, and old houses made strange noises, right? But as I went about my duties, cleaning the rooms and ensuring everything was in order, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the third day, the strange occurrences intensified. Objects I had placed in one spot would move when I wasn't looking. I'd hear whispers in the dead of night, too faint to make
out the words, but enough to send chills down my spine.
Doors that I had firmly shut would creak open on their own, and the footsteps they returned every night, always stopping just outside my door. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was the isolation and the eerie atmosphere of the house getting to me, but deep down I knew something was terribly wrong. Hollow Creek Manor was hiding something, and I was beginning to fear I might not be the only one living here. On the fourth night, things took a darker turn. I had just finished cleaning the sitting room when I noticed one of the portraits hanging crooked on the wall. I walked over to straighten it, but as my fingers brushed the frame, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I pulled my hand back, staring at the portrait, It was of a woman, her expression severe, her eyes dark and piercing. But there was something about her gaze that unsettled me. I felt as if she was looking directly at me, not in the way a painting typically does, but with intent. I quickly turned away, my heart racing. That night, the footsteps didn't stop at my door. They came inside. I awoke to the sound of the door creaking open. The room was pitch black, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering in through the window. I could hear the soft, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor, closer and closer to my bed. My breath caught in my throat as I felt a presence standing at the foot of the bed. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight I kept on the bedside table. My hand trembled as I clicked it on, casting a beam of light into the room. But there was nothing there. The door was wide open, but the room was empty. I barely slept after that. The days passed in a blur, each one more terrifying than the last. I became paranoid, jumping at every little noise, convinced that something was watching me. The footsteps became more frequent, and the whispers more insistent. I felt like I was being hunted, like the house itself was alive and it wanted me gone. On the seventh night, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things, determined to leave the manor behind. But as I reached the front door, something stopped me. It was a voice, low and menacing, coming from the shadows at the top of the staircase. "You can't leave." My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to look, but the staircase was empty. Still, the voice lingered in the air, filling the house with a sense of dread. I ran out the door, not bothering to lock it behind me. I jumped into my car and sped down the long, winding driveway, glancing in the rearview mirror as the manor disappeared behind the trees. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Hollow Creek Manor had let me go, but I knew deep down that it wasn't finished with me. The house held its secrets close, and I had barely scratched the surface. And as I sped down the empty road, I couldn't help but wonder how many others had tried to leave and never made it out.